Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the boundaries of magic in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, The Vessel of a God. Midnight was fast approaching when the trade ship reached the port of Inver, a handful of stars scattered here and there on an otherwise clouded sky. Shay stood leaned against the railing, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he watched Constance practically jump up and down in excitement while she waited for two sailors to finish connecting the gangplank to the port. She didn't seem to have a single thought to spare for anything but the fact that she was about to step onto familiar soil again. He might have smiled at that, under different circumstances. They hadn't talked about where she was headed next, and as far as he knew, she didn't have enough gold to pay for his services after tonight. This was where they were supposed to separate, possibly never to see each other again. Just a merc who had completed his job, and the employer who had paid him to do it. Except this particular employer was not like the others. This particular employer was a woman who seemed connected to him somehow, through her mysterious episodes that she had yet to reveal anything to him about, and who could potentially be the key to finding out the truth about himself. But the rolled-up parchment inside his jacket felt like it was burning against his side as he kept watching Constance. But she was also supposedly on the run from the Adrestian Empire, and anyone who turned her in would get a hefty sum of gold as thanks. During their trip back to Fodlan, he had been trying to connect the dots for how Constance could possibly be wanted for attempting to murder the Adrestian Emperor. He didn't know much about her, but she didn't seem like the type to coldly try to murder someone, and he couldn't understand why she would even want the Emperor dead in the first place. She gave the impression that she was a pretty ordinary noblewoman like any other except for the episodes and the intensity of her personality, so why would she want to kill someone who made her noble life possible to begin with? Does it matter? Arvel asked, a bodiless voice echoing in his head. He should have gotten used to it at this point, but even now it came as a small shock to have someone respond to his thoughts. The important detail here is that we now have a perfectly valid excuse to make a visit to the palace. He looked around to make sure no one was watching him too closely before replying. We've been through this, he murmured, barely an audible voice above the breeze. We don't know exactly what she did, or what they'll do to her if they get their hands on her. I'm not bringing her to her death just so I can get some gold. Some gold, you say? Arvel muttered. 1 million gold. Allow me to clarify, that is enough to last you for nearly 20 years with no additional mercenary work necessary if you live as sparsely as you do today. Shay paused. 20 years? Could it really be that long? He started trying to count in his head, but didn't come very far before Arvel interrupted the process. Furthermore, it is more likely that she will be sent to the dungeons rather than executed. I'm certain the palace dungeons are more comfortable than some of the places where you have slept in the past. Shay shook his head, feeling anxiety ache in his chest. He didn't like the fact that Arvel was making sense as he always was. Deflecting seemed like the best option. Why do you care? You've never seemed interested in money before. I want answers, Arvel shot back immediately. We know that our best chance at finding those answers exists within the palace walls, in the shape of a certain someone, and this is the first time that we have a viable way inside. Turning in a wanted criminal will grant us their favor. Shay was silent. It was true that they had been searching for answers for a long time without making much progress, but he didn't want to sacrifice someone else's life for his own sake. And yet, the thought of being able to finally have some answers was tempting as was, he had to admit, the thought of having 1 million gold in the bank. He pushed away from the railing with a sigh, his thoughts still in turmoil. He could hear Constance's excited chatter in the background, but it was distant and barely registered in his mind. He needed to figure out what to do. But then the gangplank was put in place, and Constance bounded down it and onto the pier. Shay was about to follow when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, by one of the sailors. A gleam of metal that shouldn't be there. Constance! Shay called out, drawing his sword as he ran down the gangplank. Get behind me! Constance was momentarily taken aback by Shay's sudden outburst, but to her credit, she quickly obeyed, ducking behind him as he placed himself in front of her to shield her from the three men standing near the end of the gangplank. The sailors looked up, two of the three very clearly confused, as Shay kept his eyes fixed on the gleam of metal. Now that he was closer, he could see that it was a dagger, held in a steady hand by one of the men. The sailor's eyes were cold and hard, and Shay knew instantly that he was not just a simple sailor, but a professional killer. The other two sailors slowly backed away, clearly reluctant to get involved. "Who are you?" Shay asked, holding up his sword in a prepared stance as he stared down the man with the dagger. He could feel Constance's fear and confusion radiating behind his back, but he had to focus on what was happening in front of him. The man didn't respond, instead lunging forward with a quick swipe of his dagger. Shay was ready, though, and he easily deflected the attack. His sword rang out as he blocked the blade, the other man's eyes widening in surprise. Shay didn't give him a chance to recover, swinging his sword in a swift, fluid motion, and the sailor stumbled back, dodging just in time to avoid a killing blow. "I don't want to fight you," Shay said, his voice firm. "But I will if I have to. I'm not letting you take her." Constance made a strange sound behind him, a mixture of surprise and dismay, but he ignored it for now and focused on the threat standing before them. The man still didn't speak, but he did launch another attack, more quickly than Shay had expected. This time, he was caught off guard, and he stumbled back as the man's dagger sliced through the air just inches from his face, alive only because his instincts had kicked in and dodged the attack in the last second. "Shay!" Constance cried out. He regained his balance and launched a counter-attack, their blades clashing together with a loud metallic ring. The sailor moved with fluid grace, once again revealing his background as more than just a simple sailor. Had this man even been with them on the ship? He couldn't remember seeing his face before. But Shay was no ordinary merc, either. Grinning, he called forth his second sword, then went on the offensive. He only just caught a gleam of surprise in the sailor's eyes before he threw up his dagger to parry, stumbling back as he tried to defend himself against Shay's relentless attacks. "You've messed with the wrong merc," Shay called out, even as sweat beaded on his brow. With each attack, he was getting a better feel for the man's style, and he began to gain the upper hand. But just when he managed to knock the dagger out of his hand, the man was joined by 6 others coming in from the shadows, people dressed in dark assassin's clothing and brandishing blades of their own, and Shay found himself facing off against not 1, but 7 professional fighters. He cursed under his breath, now surrounded on all sides except behind him, but behind him was only Constance, and the sea. "You should have just walked away," one of the new arrivals sneered. "What in the world is happening?" Constance asked, her voice trembling. "The bounty," Shay said, hearing her draw for air behind him. "That has to be it. Why else would 7 or possibly more trained killers wait for her in the harbor?" "No," she breathed, gripping his arm. "No, it's Shay, we need to leave. Now." "Do you know how to fly?" he shot back, shaking her off. If he wanted a single chance in hell to win this fight, he needed to be ready for an attack at any moment. The 7 men closed in on them, their swords raised and ready to strike. Shay braced himself, preparing for the inevitable fight. "Shay," Arvel called out in his head. "Not now," Shay growled, trying to keep track of the movements of all 7 men. If he used his powers to warp behind one of them, he could take out 2, maybe 3, before the others had regained themselves. But if he warped, then Constance would be left to fend for herself, leaving her vulnerable to be kidnapped or worse, killed. And he couldn't take her with him. "You are overwhelmed," Arvel insisted. "You cannot win this fight alone." He huffed out a laugh, filling with confidence just for spite. Arvel had been with him for years at this point, and he still doubted him. "So what should I do?" he asked bitterly. "Leave her behind." Before Arvel could respond, the first attacker lunged forward, and Shay swung his sword, blocking the attack and countering with a swift strike of his own. The man dodged, and the others joined in the attack, their swords clashing against Shay's with a shower of sparks. Shay was outnumbered and outmatched, but he refused to give up. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, his swords ablur as he swung and parried, dodged, and attacked. But despite his best efforts, the attackers were closing in, their blades cutting closer and closer with each passing second. One of them cast a dark spell in his direction, which he dodged just in time. He could hear Constance's frightened cries behind him, but he didn't dare take his eyes off of the attackers. He fought fiercely, his sword flashing in the light from the lanterns around them as he blocked and countered their strikes, physical as well as magical. But despite his best efforts, he was slowly being worn out, feeling his sword arms start to tire. "I can help," Arvel offered impatiently. Shay gritted his teeth as he ducked away from 2 coordinated attacks, then dodged a magic spell with minimal margin. "Help how?" he ground out in the midst of another quick dodge. "Allow me to demonstrate." Shay hesitated, not sure what exactly Arvel meant by that. Wasn't he already helping with his powers? Was there more he could do? One of the attackers fired a spell not toward Shay, but toward Constance, and he only just managed to shove her to the side and out of the way before it hit. Realizing he wouldn't be able to get them out of this alone, he resigned himself to making use of whatever powers Arvel was able to give him. "All right," he exclaimed, trying to shield Constance as the mage attacked once again. He took a hit to the shoulder and clenched his jaw in order not to scream out. "Do it, whatever it is." As he spoke those words, he felt a surge of energy, a sudden clarity of mind as a new and unfamiliar power flowed into him. He inhaled sharply, feeling his lungs fill with fresh oxygen and his muscles with renewed strength, at the same time as his limbs started glowing with what could only be Arvel's magic leaking out of him. 2 of the men darted toward him with their blades again, and Shay ordered his body to dodge and retaliate, but nothing happened. He had half a second to panic, thinking something must have gone wrong. Then his body moved on its own. It brought him quickly to the side, evading the attacks before slicing so deftly and cleanly through the air with his swords that the 2 men were taken out in seconds. The other attackers were caught off guard, and Shay, or rather, Arvel, was able to drive all 3 of them back, disarming them in just a few strikes. Shay felt his consciousness flicker back and forth as Arvel took over the fight. Still images of surprised faces, of pain, of blood, and of Constance's shocked expression burned into his mind between short bursts of clear moments where he saw his swords swing in the air and his hands glow with dark magic. And then, so suddenly it was jarring, his consciousness was pushed to the forefront again, and he stood panting over 7 corpses littered on the ground around them. The harbor was silent, with everyone else having fled the area as soon as the fight began, and the air stank of blood and death. His gaze darted between the bodies, his mind still reeling from the shock of it all. He swallowed. Could Arvel take over like that at any moment? And just wreak absolute havoc? A squeak behind him jerked him out of his own thoughts, and he slowly turned around to see Constance cowering on the ground near the edge of the pier. She was staring at him like she was afraid he might go after her next. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to relax his shoulders. His second sword blinked out of existence as he knelt down in front of her. "Are you okay?" he asked as softly as he could, scanning her face and upper body for signs that she'd been physically harmed. "Aye," she stammered, clearly shaken. He reached for her, but she jerked back with a small whine. Shay could feel his own heart pounding in his chest, and for a moment, he forgot about the price on Constance's head and the dangerous people who wanted to capture her. He even forgot about the bounty. In that moment, all that mattered was making sure that she wasn't afraid of him. "Constance," he said as he held her panicked gaze, "I won't hurt you. You're safe now." She didn't look convinced. He could see the fear and confusion in her eyes, and he didn't blame her. He himself was still in shock over what had just happened. He couldn't imagine how it must have looked to her, to have him suddenly transformed into a weapon of destruction, to see her protector turn into a monster and take out 7 people in a matter of seconds. If he wanted her to be able to trust him again, he might need to give her a piece of the truth. He took a deep breath. "Listen. What you just saw, that wasn't me. I've told you of this power inside me, but the truth is..." "No, you idiot." Arvel's sharp comment came so unexpectedly that Shay lost track of his sentence, cutting himself off before he could explain. Constance stared at him in heightened confusion. "Do not tell her about me," Arvel hissed. "Not now. Do you really believe that the truth will make her less afraid?" Shay paused, looking away from Constance as he processed the words. "No," he whispered. Arvel sighed deeply, then tooted at him in annoyance. "You do not intend to turn her in, do you?" "No," Shay repeated softly. "She's a friend. I can't do that to her." "Shay. Constance breathed, drawing his attention back to her. She was leaning away from him, her eyes still filled with fear. "With whom are you speaking?" He winced as he met her gaze. At the moment, he felt like he couldn't think clearly. Maybe he should just take Arvel's advice and keep him a secret for now. It didn't feel right, but it made sense that it wouldn't ease her mind to hear that he had a strange, powerful being inside him that he could talk to whenever he wanted. "I do apologize for this," Arvel said before he could decide what to answer her, a note of regret in his voice that made Shay tense automatically. "However, I cannot allow this opportunity to go to waste." "What, no?" Before Shay could react, he felt the same surge of power as before, but this time, he knew what it meant, and instinctively tried to fight back. His muscles were already almost completely unresponsive, and the only thing he could do was make himself groan and double over, gritting his teeth against Arvel's strength as it threatened to overpower him, and as his consciousness started withdrawing somewhere into the back of his mind again. "Arvel, what are you doing?" "Doing what you are too faint of heart to do on your own," came the response, but this time from his own lips. The shock of hearing himself speak in such a cool tone of voice, and of being completely unable to stop his mouth from moving to form the words, was enough to make him lose the strength to continue struggling. "You can't. Are you really handing her over to the Emperor?" "Arvel, don't." The next thing he saw was a still image of Constance with a horrified expression on her face as one of his hands reached out toward her. Hubert stood in the shadows of an empty market stall, watching from a safe distance as the mercenary who radiated elder power grabbed hold of Constance's arm and tugged her to her feet, then spun her around and locked her arms behind her back. Beside him, Nick moved as if to intervene, hand going to one of her blades. Hubert held up a hand, causing her to stop and look back at him from beneath her sailor's cap. A few loose strands of hair had escaped from beneath its rim, and the expression on her face as she peered at him bordered on suspicion. "Sir." Hubert's gaze moved back to the scene on the pier, where the man was nimbly tying Constance's wrists together with a rope he'd found lying on a large crate nearby. By his feet and all around them lay 7 dead men. He was completely silent while Constance attempted to communicate with him, speaking in a voice that grew in volume for every second that he did not react. "You have studied this man for weeks," Hubert said quietly. "What is your approximation of his intentions?" Nick looked back at the scene as well. Constance had just screamed out, causing the man to quickly rip a shred of fabric off his shirt and tie it as a makeshift gag over her mouth. "He is a mercenary who has seen the wanted poster," Nick replied, "and she's run out of money to pay him with. I would have thought he had more honor than this, but judging by what he's doing now, I'd say he's intending to hand her over to the Emperor." Hubert shook his head. No, sir. I agree with your conclusions as far as his intentions go. However, I do not believe that this is quite the same man you have been spying on in Morphais. He is likely not doing this for the money. He had seen the fight with his own eyes, had seen the complete slaughter it had ended in. The 7 men had been skilled fighters, and had seemed to have the upper hand over the mercenary, but then something had changed. Something that, however much Hubert wished that it wasn't so, reminded him very much of another mercenary he had once been hesitant to trust near Lady Edelgard. He couldn't shake off the feeling of familiarity he had with the man's movements, the way he fought with power beyond human abilities. If the Church of Ceros can implant the consciousness of a goddess into an otherwise ordinary man, he said softly, why shouldn't those who slither in the dark be able to do the same? After all, the latter did steal their technology from the Church. Nick was silent for a moment as she took this in, and as they watched Constance struggle against her kidnapper. Are you suggesting that Shay is the vessel for an Agarthan god? She asked. He smiled tightly. I am suggesting that it is a possibility. Hubert's words hung in the air between them as they both continued to watch the man who called himself Shay. He couldn't exactly say that he enjoyed seeing his fiancée be handled so roughly, or for that sake to see her in distress at all, but he recognized that this was a foe beyond his capabilities. However much he wished to intervene, doing so would likely only result in his own quick death. Your orders, sir? Nick asked quietly, her hand still resting on her blade. He could hear impatience in her voice, giving him the impression that she may have become fond of Constance during her assignment. If so, she couldn't be blamed. He knew firsthand just how difficult it was not to be charmed by the whirlwind known as Constance von Novelli. Hubert thought for a moment, his eyes never leaving the scene on the pier. Although he did not exactly like the idea of allowing the mercenary to go through with his plan. "We need to be careful," he said. "Vessel of a god or no, this man is clearly too powerful for us to take on at the moment." He watched as Shay picked up Constance and slung her over his shoulder. He moved with purpose, heading away from the pier and deeper into the city. However, the palace would be closed to visitors this late at night, even if those visitors had a bounty to deliver. Any handover would need to be delayed until morning at the earliest, which meant that their kidnapper needed a safe place to rest and wait until the right moment. He turned to Nick, a serious expression on his face. "Follow them. Keep me informed of any movements. As soon as they head toward the palace or he makes any other move, I want to know about it. And as usual, intervene only if she is exposed to any immediate danger." There was no need for him to tell her to be cautious in the powerful man's presence, she would know better than anyone what she was up against. Nick nodded, pulling her sailor's cap down further over her eyes as she blended back into the shadows, leaving Hubert to contemplate their next move. He knew that the situation was far from ideal, and that there was a great deal of risk involved. But he also knew that it was necessary. A man who could take out 7 attackers in a matter of seconds was not to be trifled with. And if fortune was on their side, they might be able to turn this into an advantage rather than a disadvantage. 3 of the few people Hubert currently trusted sat around the table in Claudia von Vestra's kitchen, silently studying the schematics he had placed before them while they listened to the instructions he gave regarding the suggested point of entry, their possible paths through the palace and what risks each path entailed. Then he went on to detail the objectives of the mission, including on which objective each one would focus their attention, and the distraction that would enable the success of the operation. When he was finished, he stood back and waited for their thoughts. All 3 of them were capable strategists in their own right. His sister had undergone similar training to Hubert, with special focus on covert operations and tactics. Sylvain hailed from a house that had traditionally brought up commanders incredibly capable in the military arts, not to mention the personal ability he had to quickly recognize patterns and details others often missed, and Happy, apart from being a natural at disputing everything which Hubert said or did, had taken part in enough of Yuri's schemes to have gained a good understanding of the anatomy of a covert operation such as this one. This constellation promised to bring quite useful feedback to his plans. Of course, there was still a rather sensitive matter he was loath to bring up. "The distraction you're referring to," Sylvain said, immediately latching on to the one point Hubert had hoped to avoid going into detail about. "What distraction is that, exactly?" Preferably, he would have liked to decline answering, but even if he hadn't received the question, he knew that there was one very vital fact that all of them needed to be aware of. "Yes, apologies for the ambiguity," he said while trying not to look at Happy. "I have it on good authority that Constance will arrive in the palace within a day's time, most likely in the morning. She will be our distraction for Lysias." Happy stood up so quickly that her chair fell backward. "What?" "Believe me," he said, now forcing himself to meet her gaze, "I'd rather not use her as such. However, I had no choice in the matter. She has been taken hostage by an incredibly powerful man, rivaled perhaps only by Byleth himself. I do not believe that he intends to harm her, only turn her in for the bounty, and in fact, I am convinced that we will have a better chance at rescuing her while she is in Lysia's claws than we will as long as this other man has her." Silence fell over the room. Even Happy seemed to understand the severity of that statement, as she slowly righted the chair and sat down again, refusing to meet his gaze. He could feel the weight of the new information hang heavily in the air as he waited for their response. Sylvain was the first to speak, his tone measured and thoughtful. "So, we use Constance as a distraction to enter the palace and complete our mission. And then, we rescue her from Lysias. That's the plan." Hubert nodded. "Yes, that is correct. We use the kidnapping to our advantage. However, I'm sure there is no need for me to spell out how paramount it is that Constance does not come to harm. I will personally lead the mission to rescue her from Lysias, and I need you all to focus on the other objectives. Our success in this operation depends on us working together and executing our plan flawlessly, and it will not be easy. We shall have to be careful and precise in our movements. We don't know what kind of security Lysias has in place, so we will need to be prepared for anything. Sylvain nodded in understanding, his expression serious. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly. Right, Happy, he added, turning to his wife. The other redhead looked a bit skeptical, but she finally nodded in reluctant agreement. Yeah. Fine. But if anything happens to Constance, she said, pinning Hubert in place with her hard gaze, I'll kill you. He smiled tightly. A fair deal. What do we do if things don't go according to plan? Claudia asked. I assume you have fail-safes in place. Hubert sighed. I have, he confirmed, but I hope it shall not come to that. The less attention we draw to ourselves, the better. So, what's our next move? Sylvain asked. We shall leave tomorrow at dawn, Hubert said. It is likely that Shay will turn her in at the earliest possible time. I'll go over the final details with each of you individually before we depart. And, there is one last, vital, piece of information of which you all should be aware. He paused, gaze hovering briefly on Claudia as he considered his next words one last time. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew that he couldn't leave their operation up to chance. They needed to know the full picture in case they encountered Lysias in the palace. This information is to be kept confidential, and not to be shared with anyone outside of this group. Understood. The three of them nodded in unison, their expressions now serious. Good, Hubert said. He inhaled deeply before continuing. Lysias is not just any member of those who slither in the dark. He is Lord Lucas von Hresvelg, the 11th Hresvelg child and second in line to the throne. Thales has removed all memories of his childhood and manipulated him to serve their gains. Keep this in mind, as it is vital that we keep him alive at all costs. The group sat in stunned silence for several minutes, grappling with the enormity of the situation. Sylvain and Happy looked at each other, processing the new information and trying to understand the implications. However, it was Claudia who finally spoke, her voice quivering with emotion. Are you certain of this, Hubert? He turned to her, expression grim. The evidence is undeniable. Lysias is a Hresvelg, of that, I am sure. Claudia's hand shook as she placed it on her forehead. This changes everything, she said. We cannot allow Thales to manipulate a member of the Hresvelg family. We need to rescue Lord Lucas and restore his memories. Hubert nodded, relieved to hear that his sister shared his sentiments. Agreed. The preservation of the Hresvelg family and their legacy is crucial to the stability of the empire. That is why we must be extra cautious in our mission. We must not only rescue Constance and rid her of the curse, but we must also ensure that Lord Lucas is not further manipulated by Thales. He looked at each of them in turn, making certain that they understood the gravity of the situation. This is a delicate matter that requires precision and expertise. We must not fail in our mission. Are we all clear on our objectives and the risks involved? Sylvain and Happy nodded immediately, their expressions reflecting their determination to see this through to the end. Claudia, however, looked a bit more hesitant, her eyes reflecting the turmoil she no doubt felt at this new key detail. While she did not possess many memories of Lord Lucas, seeing as she had been forced to keep her identity hidden and not interact directly with any of the Hresvelg children, she had nevertheless been brought up to value and care deeply for the imperial line, and just as Hubert, she had grieved the deaths of the 10 children who did not survive Thales' cruel experiments. Claudia. Hubert prompted gently, needing to hear her confirmation along with that of the others. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a determined expression of her own. Yes, she said firmly. I am clear on the objectives. We need to do what is necessary in order to save Lord Lucas and restore balance to the Empire. He smiled briefly before turning serious again. Good, he said. Now, let us go over the details one last time and make any necessary adjustments to the plan. And with that, the group began their final preparations for the operation. They discussed the plan several more times, covering potential roadblocks and coming up with contingency plans. The four of them worked well together, each one bringing their own unique skills and perspectives to the table, and Hubert was especially pleased to see the strategic capabilities of his own sister shine during their discussions. However, as they continued to work, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He had known from the very beginning that this operation would be dangerous, but now with Constance's safety on the line as well, the stakes were even higher. He just hoped that he had made the right decision and that their plan would be enough to keep her safe. Chapter 22, The True Enemy, PT1. Constance stumbled forward wearily, feet tripping over each other as she attempted to keep up with the pace of her captor, who strode on ahead without once looking over his shoulder. He did not need to, although he did not physically hold the ropes in his hand. He had a firm grip around her by use of some of the most powerful magical force she had ever experienced. It held her in a vice grip, tugging her forward steadily as Shay, or who might once have been Shay, walked onward through the still dark streets of Inver, heading for what she could only assume was the end goal, the Imperial Palace of Adrestia. It was early enough in the morning that only the most early risers and workers had the surely odd experience of seeing a determined man with shockingly violet hair walk through the streets while pulling a bound and stumbling woman behind him, the two of them connected only through a gleaming magical tether that was just barely discernible in the dim lighting. While she did not bother even glancing in the direction of her observers, she hardly believed they would lift a finger to aid her. At any rate, Constance held no doubt that many of them stared for much longer than could be deemed appropriate as they walked past. At this point, she had all but ceased her struggles. In the moment that Shay had assailed her in the harbor, she had fully believed that he intended to kill her. She had been so afraid at that moment, so terrified and confused at his sudden shift toward her. She could not know his motives other than guess at them based on what she knew about him, and she had suspected for some time already that his supposed connection to those who slithered in the dark did not bode well. After he had taken her away from the harbor and broken into an empty shed to lock her inside for the night, she had spent a good hour or so panicking over her circumstances and what in the world she was supposed to do. She had tried not to think too much of what Shay might want with her, but it was difficult to distract herself from the fact that there was quite the large bounty placed on her head, and that the one who had issued that bounty was her most bitter enemy, who likely wished to see her dead. Her attempts at breaking out of her bonds had been absolutely useless, without her magic, as she had been for so long now that she barely remembered what it felt like to channel a spell anymore. She was easy prey, especially for someone as Shay. She could not quite wrap her head around what had gone wrong. Had Shay simply waited to strike until now, when he had an opportunity to achieve wealth through very little effort on his part? Had he been planning this ever since he accidentally saw the wanted poster outside of their rooms in Morpheus? Or had he planned to stab her in the back from the very moment they met? Shame on her for thinking that he did not have the brain capacity to betray her so well. Although, there was something different about him now. Something had happened, there in the harbor, something which had changed not only the way that he treated her, but also how he moved, and given a new depth to his gaze that she could not remember having seen before. Usually, while Shay was quick to notice danger, he often seemed to be rather distracted and absent-minded. However, now his gaze reminded her of how Hubert used to take in a new area. It was alert and intelligent, seeming to take in everything around them with an analytical curiosity that did not at all befit Shay as she had come to know him. No, something had changed in the harbor. Something had taken over. Have you ever heard of someone who's had something awakened inside them? That question, the one which Shay had asked her back in Morpheus several weeks ago, had haunted her mind in the past night. Was this what he had referred to? Had she simply assumed that he had meant magical power, when in fact, some other part of him had literally awakened within him? Had Shay been cursed by Lysias as well, in order to find and capture Constance and bring her back to the palace? Except this curse was stronger, more potent, and could take him over at any time. It would certainly make sense if Shay's willpower was weaker than Lysias. Even Constance could barely withstand Lysias' magical authority, and she was Constance von Novelli, sorcerer extraordinaire. At the moment, she did not have enough clues to make any definitive conclusions. She could only make predictions, and that would have to be enough for now. Now that she at least knew what he intended to do with her, she felt some of her usual confidence returning. The magical tether that held her captive seemed to be unbreakable, but Constance refused to give up. She would bide her time, keep her eyes open, and wait for an opportunity to escape. Until then, she would keep her head held high and her spirit unbroken, no matter what lay ahead. That was the duty of a Novelli. As they finally approached the imposing gates of the Imperial Palace, Constance was struck by the sheer size and grandeur of the structure. In her youth, She had viewed this building as a place of possibilities, of new connections, new experiences, and yet another chance to prove her splendor to both the world and the imperial family. After she moved in with Hubert some months ago, it had become her new home, spacious, yet perfectly comfortable for her and her large personality. However, approaching it in this manner while being tugged along behind a traitor she had once called her ally, her body wrapped in ropes so tight that she could hardly even move her arms, the palace's shadow seemed so immensely daunting that it felt very nearly as though she was walking straight into the jaws of a hungry beast. A pair of guards stood by the gates, their faces ominously shadowed in the dim light cast by the lanterns at their sides. One of them was burly with a young face but firm expression, the other tall with a well-groomed beard and intelligent eyes. With a jolt, Constance realized that she recognized the taller man. She had waved to him in greeting many times while returning back to the palace after one of her outings, and a couple of times she had even gifted him with a snack or two from the city in order to brighten his day. Feeling a faint sense of hope at seeing his familiar face, Constance tried to speak through her gag, hoping that he would move to aid her. It only came out as muffled murmurs, however, and the guard barely even looked at her. He simply gave her a brief glance before turning his attention to Shay. Constance deflated again. Surely he must recognize her, the fiancée of his superior, but it seemed that he ultimately did not care about her. This was simply work to him, a day at his post, just like any other. And if Hubert himself has informed him that I am to be received as little more than a package to be delivered, then why would he ever think twice about those orders? Shay did not speak as the guard studied his face with discerning eyes. The man clearly noted that something was odd about their early morning visitor, although Constance noted that the magical tether had weakened somewhat and was no longer visible, as though Shay wished to conceal his powers in the palace. And after another glance in Constance's direction, the tall guard stepped back to open the gates, gesturing for the two of them to enter. Constance hesitated, but was soon tugged forward via the ropes. She stepped inside with some trepidation, uncertain what to expect. She had no idea how many of the guards or servants were under Lysia's control, or whether Lady Edelgard was even safe. The guard led them through the grand halls of the palace, past ornate tapestries and majestic chandeliers, their steps echoing between the walls along with the hushed whispers of a pair of servants who had paused near a grand arch that Constance knew would eventually lead to the room where Lady Edelgard and Lord Byleth usually took their breakfast. Perhaps if she screamed as loudly as she could. Perhaps then they would come running, and it would be revealed that it had all been an immense mistake. But then, she realized as she was tugged around a corner and out of the servants' sight, they might not be able to lift a finger even if they found out about her presence in the palace. Perhaps they were held under an elder spell so powerful that not even Byleth himself would be able to fight back. And even if they weren't, she did not know how Shay might react if she began to scream at the top of her lungs. They reached a door at the end of a hallway, in front of which the guard stopped. He rapped his knuckles on its surface 3 times, and a muffled voice from within soon called out, "Enter." Constance swallowed, heart pounding in her chest as she heard the voice and noted its familiarity. And yet there was very little she could do as the guard opened the door with a swift gesture and indicated for them to enter. The room, which Constance had rarely had a reason to visit other than to pass through it in search of her fiancé, was large and imposing, with high ceilings and a single wide stained glass window in the back that usually allowed a surprising amount of light to shine into the room in the mornings after the sun had risen, softly bathing the room in its colorful patterns. The room was one of the palace's many parlors, holding a group of ornate couches and a just as luxurious coffee table by which guests could have their hot beverage of choice, perhaps together with a piece of cake. However, due to the room's vicinity to Hubert's study, she knew that he tended to sometimes come here for a change in environment as he did his paperwork. She could almost see him there now, seated on one of the couches with his legs crossed as he pored over some document or other, nothing too confidential, of course, only the documents related to his more ministerial duties, while occasionally leaning forward to refill his cup of coffee. But today, those couches were empty. Instead, by a side table near the window, stood a man of considerable height, his back to them as he carefully nudged a drawer closed. He was dressed in the attire of a high-ranking imperial official, most of his figure obscured by a long dark cape with a tall collar. As the door closed behind them, the man turned around, and Constance swallowed as her suspicions about the voice's owner were confirmed. What met her was the face of her own fiancé, a face she hadn't seen in weeks, and which she had fervently wished that she would never again need to see under such circumstances. His eyes were cold and calculating as they swept over her and Shay. As his gaze landed on her face, a small smirk appeared on his lips, although it vanished in the next second. Constance felt her knees go weak at the sheer darkness she saw in those eyes. "Well, well," he said as he walked toward the two of them with smooth steps. "It seems our search is over at last." After so long away from the palace and from Hubert, hearing his voice again felt surreal, even more so when she knew that this was simply an impostor. This particular impostor, however, had once been able to trick even Constance herself that he was the true Hubert. Even now, she had to remind herself that it could not be Hubert. The real Hubert would never greet her so coldly, even though she had escaped the dungeons against his wishes. The real Hubert would want to make certain that she was unharmed, and assure her that she was in no danger here. However, this Hubert very likely wished her dead. He strode right past Shay, giving him nary a glance before coming to a stop so close to Constance that she instinctively wanted to back away from his looming presence. However, she knew that the spell Shay had over her wouldn't allow it, so instead she forced herself to look up at him, trying to communicate with her eyes just how much she despised him and how obvious it was to her that he was not her Hubert, despite his strikingly identical appearance. Once again, she saw his lips briefly tug into a smirk. "Constance," he spoke in a low voice, his eyes never leaving her face. "Long time no see." She felt a chill run down her spine at the iciness in his voice, but the fear quickly turned to anger instead. With a scowl, she tried to speak, but her words were muffled by the gag in her mouth. Lysias simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You may go," he said in a slightly louder voice, clearly addressing Shay this time, although he still seemed completely uninterested in her captor. "The guard will accompany you and ascertain that you receive your reward money." Constance felt a slight tug forward, and then the spell that had held her in its grip faded away completely. She glanced at Shay and saw him stand frozen in place, his gaze flicking between Constance and the man wearing Hubert's face. There was something wary in his eyes, as though he suspected what would happen the moment that he left the room. With one last desperate look, she pleaded for him to stay. "Help me, please. I can forgive you." If there was so much as an inkling of concern remaining for her in his body. If he had ever truly cared about her well-being. Perhaps she could still reach through to him. But her silent pleas went unanswered. Shaking his head almost ruefully, Shay turned on his heel and made his way to the door, the guard following closely behind. Constance watched him go with a sucking sensation in her stomach. She could practically feel Lysia's magic oozing out of him when he was this close to her. It was a sensation she had never made note of in his presence before, but in the wake of her own magic, the blinding power that emanated from his direction was impossible to ignore. The door closed with a soft click, and silence fell over them. All she could hear was her own breathing and her heartbeats thudding in her ears. Then, Lysias let out a coldly amused huff. He reached out to grab her chin with a gloved hand and angled it toward him, forcing her to look up into his face. She glared at him at those narrow eyes, the sharp angles of his jaw, the hair that nearly concealed one eye from view, wishing that the goddess would listen to her pleas and kill him where he stood. He calmly met her gaze, clearly unafraid of the pure hatred she sent him through her eyes. "I heard you no longer have access to your magic," he said, his voice taking on a note of mock sympathy. "What a cruel fiancé you have." Slow, almost sluggish steps, as if they were both walking through thick mud. Faded images framed by blurry corners. "This way, sir, in the treasury." Shay tried to stay aware of what was happening, but it was hard to even keep himself afloat when there was another force that constantly pushed him back down below the surface. Images as seen through his own eyes kept flashing past, there in 1 second and gone the next. Sometimes entire minutes seemed to pass in a heartbeat, and then other times one single second lasted 5 times as long as it should. And all that he could do was to try to stay aware, try to keep track of what was happening, while someone else steered his body in directions he didn't understand. The image of Constance's pleading face, first in the harbor and then just now before he left her, was burned into his mind. She'd looked afraid, but not only that today, she'd also looked like she knew. Like she knew that something was wrong, that something had taken control over him. And for a moment, Arvel had seemed to pause. The strange thing about being pushed into the back of his own mind by another being was that suddenly, he couldn't just speak to Arvel, he could feel him. He had been able to feel his hesitation when he saw the way the dark-haired man with the narrow eyes had looked at Constance. He could sense him deliberating about what to do. But he couldn't actually stop him from leaving, and he couldn't stop him from following after the guard either. All he could do was try to communicate with Arvel, through the channel that had always used to lead in the opposite direction. Arvel, he tried, barely more than a faint thought in a busy mind, but he sensed that Arvel could hear him. That guy is going to kill her. You know that, right? Arvel didn't stop, or tense, or anything that indicated any kind of concern, but he did slow his steps somewhat, just enough to give him some distance from the guard ahead of him. And then Shay felt the force give some leeway, allowing him to catch his breath above the surface for a little while. I shall remember her sacrifice, Arvel said softly. Her sacrifice? You mean how you sacrificed her? It is a necessary precaution, Arvel said. The man she is with holds great power, I could sense it. Better that his focus remains on her than shifts to us at such a critical point. Even though Arvel didn't say it out loud, Shay could somehow hear a continuation of his thought process in their shared mind space, great power. Almost reminiscent of. But that cannot be. Thales did not understand. Thales. That name rang a bell for some reason. But something told him Arvel wouldn't be too happy if he asked about something he wasn't supposed to even hear. What critical point? He asked instead. Arvel let out a small sigh. This is why it was necessary that I take over, he said so quietly that it was barely audible. You do not understand. You may never understand, for you have not seen what I have seen. Alas, you do not need to understand, your mission ends here, where mine begins. A thrum of power went through his body, a similar sensation to when Shay used to conjure his second sword. Arvel. No, was the instant reply, and Shay felt his consciousness start to slip away again. I am not Arvel. And I do not have time for any more of your questions. The next series of images showed a raised hand, dark violet tendrils of magic shooting out from his own fingers, and the guard slumping to the ground. Constance knew with a terrifying certainty that this would be her end. There was no smile to be found in Lysia's expression, no hint that he even intended to toy with his prey. It was made all the worse by the fact that he was wearing Hubert's face. In the eyes that she had learned to love over the past months, where she had seen true love and kindness directed at her, she now found only icy coldness. As he held her chin in a vice grip between his fingers, he angled it to the sides as though examining every pore of her face. Then, with a bitter twist of his lips, he seemed to come to a conclusion. So, he said in Hubert's voice, you really did withstand the curse. She closed her eyes against inevitable tears. All of her choices, the good ones as well as the bad, repeated before her eyes, and she saw all the diverging paths where she could have chosen differently. She could have taken Hubert's warnings about the curse to heart, and waited a little longer before undergoing the ritual. She could have trusted Hubert and stayed in the cell in the palace dungeons. Truly. She could have remembered that Hubert was the better strategist, the more careful schemer and the more experienced tactician. She could have relied on him for once rather than go along with her own extravagant ambitions and impulses. But instead, she had gone against Hubert's advice at every venture, and now, she would suffer for it. Lysia's grip tightened around her chin. Look at me, he commanded. She gritted her teeth, opening her eyes but refusing to meet his gaze. If she did, she knew that he might attempt to hex her, and that had not gone well for her before. When she didn't comply, he let go of her but only to whip his hand across her cheek. Stumbling to the side with a surprised whimper, she widened her eyes as she started to fall, but managed to stay on her feet only because he hooked his fingers around the front of her ropes and locked her in place. She looked up at him where he towered above her, looked up into that cold, uncaring expression, and wondered desperately whether if he were to remove the gag there was anything she could say to stop him from simply killing her where she stood. If only I had my magic, I would be the one to fry him in his place. According to the rumors, he said, gaze locked onto hers, you lost control at your own wedding, but only momentarily. Some here in the palace seem to view this as evidence that your willpower is stronger than mine. With a sudden motion, he jerked her toward him. She winced, wanting to close her eyes as his face came that much closer, but chose not to since she was afraid it would simply make him slap her again. "They're wrong," he said softly, breath puffing against her face. "If I'd had just a sliver more time, I would have dominated you completely. You know that, don't you? You know that both my magical strength and my willpower exceed yours." She swallowed, unable to look away from his intense expression. If he'd had more time, would he have been able to curse her more thoroughly? Would he have overpowered her? "I am the reincarnation of one of history's most powerful warriors," Lysias said in a mocking yet still deceptively soft tone. "My powers were bestowed on me by ancient Agarthan gods, for the purpose of avenging our people. You are merely a speck of dust on the sole of my shoe. I could defeat you with my hands tied behind my back." One of history's most powerful warriors? She stared into his eyes, searching for a hint as to whom or what he was referring to. Could that be true? Powers granted by the gods? She could faintly remember what Linhard had told her about the ancient Agarthan gods, which also happened to be the Morphean gods. Something concerning sleep and death? In fact, Lysias continued as he gazed back at her calmly, "If I wanted to, I could easily hex you into turning against your own loved ones or falling madly in love with me. Do you remember that feeling, Constance? Of having your own emotions turned against you?" A slithering, familiar feeling began at the back of her mind, a foggy sensation, slowly lulling her into a sense of ease at being close to someone she trusted. Someone who could love her like no one else ever could. Who could help her reach her true potential. And then Lysias scoffed, and the sensation drained away as quickly as it had appeared. She immediately looked away, ashamed of how quickly and easily he had managed to hex her this time. "Not that it matters now," he said. "Thales's generous offer for you to join us is no longer on the table. That ship has sailed, love. All we need you for now is your body." He reached up with his free hand to jerk down the gag from her mouth, causing her to gasp. "A pity," he said with no hint of emotion in his voice. "Imagine if you'd listened to reason and joined our ranks. I actually used to find the thought appealing. Can you imagine? I looked forward to ruling the empire with you by my side. But now, I just want you dead." While she had temporarily been taken aback by the sudden removal of her gag, Constance quickly found her voice again. "Why, you crude, you bastard," she exclaimed. "You absolute, despicable villain, Hubert will find you, and when he learns of what you have done, you will regret ever being born." As she spoke, a smile began on Lysias' lips, which then grew into a grin, and then when she had finished her threat, he let out a hearty chuckle as he leaned back again to create some more distance between them. "Oh," he said in a dryly amused voice, "you call me a villain?" She scowled at him. "Do you see anyone else here who fits that particular description?" He laughed a second time, then grabbed hold of her chin again. As soon as his laughter had died out, he locked gazes with her. "You truly are sure of yourself, aren't you?" He leaned in again, and his smile faded in an instant as he sneered at her. "At least I never committed genocide." Her heart jumped at the last word. Gasping for air, she stared up at him in shock as she tried to collect her thoughts, which had instantly gone blank at the mere insinuation that she had. "That's right," Lysias said, eyes narrowing. "Do you know how many people you obliterated with your clever little trick in Shamhala? How many families? Parents and their children." Her breathing stuttered as his words hit home, calling to mind flashes of images which her subconscious had never allowed her to see, images of crying children and panicked civilians amidst a chaos of fire and collapsing buildings made out of ancient stone. These were not images she had seen with her own two eyes, they were mere figments of imagination, conjured by her fragile mind after the fact, but the truth remained the same. What Lysias had just said? What he accused her of? She had suspected that it might be so, but had not allowed herself to think fully about it since that fateful night. Not after she had heard and seen the pillars of light strike the ground, and been unable to withstand the horrified exhaustion that had come over her. Not after she had cried her heart out in Hubert's arms, there in the dark forest. But she understood that it was true. All inhabitants of Shamhala had not been Thales's warriors, nor had they been powerful elder mages who could escape the destruction of the city with a flick of their wrists. They had been ordinary people, living mostly ordinary lives with their families. To be sure, they were likely outcasts from society who had fled into the earth, but so was she along with all the others in Abyss. Meaning, she could just as well have annihilated Abyss and all of its inhabitants. A Yuri, a Happy, perhaps even a Constance. Flashes of images from the destruction of another town, another life, joined in with the faux memories of dying families in Shambhala, and the anxiety was so heavy in her lungs now that she could hardly breathe. Red smoke on the horizon. Blood gleaming on the edge of a blade. Red, 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 red everywhere. And no, she stuttered out, trying to fight back against the darkness of the curse that was looming over her. Lysias watched her face closely as she tried to phrase her objections into words. I did not intend. Did not intend? He interrupted, voice growing louder. You did not intend to eradicate an entire people? Then what did you think would happen when you let loose the powers of the elders onto a city? Constance struggled to control her breathing. She should have known. Should have realized it immediately. Would it have changed her mind? Would she have acted differently if she had known? What alternative had there been? You killed my family, he spat out, and for the first time, he sounded truly emotional. She saw him swallow, saw his eyebrows twitch downward before he continued. They were good, honest people who were thoughtlessly eradicated in the genocide you committed. And you dare to tell me that you did not intend it? Is that a valid excuse to your ears? She shook her head in horror. She had killed so many people. And she had done it to defeat only 2 individuals. 2, out of at least thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Only to ascertain that Thales and Lysias could never wreak devastation in Fodlan again, as they had done with Arianrhod, a purpose which she had clearly failed to achieve at any rate. And was not the act of destroying Shambhala itself just as terrible as what they had done? Might it even be worse? You are responsible for many deaths as well, she gasped out, perhaps naively hoping that it would lighten the burden on her own shoulders. Lysias let out a bitter scoff, one corner of his mouth quirking up in dark irony. Deaths are unavoidable in war, he said, even civilian deaths at times. I don't particularly care for your kind, but even beasts have families. Surely you must see the difference between killing soldiers on the battlefield and destroying an entire city with no second thought. She gasped for breath, unable to find her voice. Destroying an entire city with no second thought. That was black smoke on the horizon, rising above the outline of rooftops, the deafening roar and smoldering heat of fire creeping closer and closer, the terrified screams of parents searching for their children among the flames. The familiar darkness brushed against her, inviting her into its embrace. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, her jaws clenching as she tried to rein herself in. She could allow herself to think about this later in a secure environment, not here, with Lysias standing in front of her, with the curse looming so close above her. She could not allow him to win so easily. She glared up at him, feeling her whole body tremble from the exertion of trying to hold back the curse. He clearly noticed her struggling, his lips shifted up into a darkly amused smirk as he watched her fight against the terrible magic he had cast on her. His face seemed to warp in front of her, back and forth between himself and the mental image that she had seen so many times in the past months, the image of his face in Shambhala, as he had spoken those appalling words, "Your brightest future is right here, by my side." "No," she gasped, shaking her head vehemently. I will not fall victim to your horrid manipulation. I am Constance von Novelli, and I do not falter." She did have the willpower to withstand the curse, the willpower to withstand him. She had done it many times before, and she could do it again. She could do it 1,000 times over. Thinking these thoughts alleviated some of the pressure coming from within, and the dark clouds parted to leave way for a hint of hope as Lysia's face stilled in front of her. She exhaled a trembling breath, relaxing her shoulders somewhat as she felt the danger pass. She had expected her momentary victory to anger Lysias, but he simply smiled. "Know this, Constance von Novelli," he said smoothly, a razor-sharp blade wrapped in silk. "If Thales didn't have other plans for you, I would kill you where you stand. And it would not be a merciful death." She could only stare up at him, into the face of the man she loved, and do nothing but feel the visceral hatred emanating from his entire being. There was no doubt in her mind that he was telling the truth. Whatever Thales needed her for, whatever nefarious purposes he intended to use her body for, That need was the only thing currently standing between her and a gruesome, painful death at the hands of a powerful elder mage with a twisted, vengeful mind. And then, as she stood there locked in his grip with this chilling knowledge spreading through her body, Lysias suddenly and violently jerked back. He released his hold of her so abruptly that she stumbled back and fell hard to the floor, unable to catch herself and wincing at the impact. When she looked up at him again, he had reached up with a hand to the back of his neck and was muttering Agarthan words below his breath as he squeezed his eyes closed, a grimace on his face. He jerked again, then bent over double, this time with a pained groan. His hand moved to his chest, digging his fingers into the front of his garments as he drew in a trembling gasp. What in the world? She could only assume that he had suddenly been gripped by a great pain, one that seemed to emanate from his chest. Could it be a creststone? Then, as a pained whimper left Lysias' lips, he suddenly transformed. In the blink of an eye and accompanied by sparks of elder magic, the facade of Hubert von Vestra dropped away in exchange for the true appearance of Lysias. Blonde hair, so light it was almost white, unnaturally dark, bottomless eyes, a pale face wearing the same pained frown as the moment before, but this time, it was accented by the black cross inked across his right eyelid. Lysias exhaled a trembling breath, shoulders lowering slowly as he took a moment to regain himself. Now that the source of the pain seemed to have dissipated, the relief was apparent on his face. He straightened again, capturing her gaze with his. Droplets of sweat adorned his forehead, and his hand was still held protectively against his chest. "Enjoy the show?" he asked breathily, now in his own voice. Even if Constance had known what to reply, she was given no time to do so. From high up in the ceiling came a burst of elder magic that struck Lysias straight in the back. He stumbled forward, eyes widening as he shot his arms out in the beginning of an elder spell of his own before freezing in place completely. Constance saw the moment that the realization dawned on his face before she herself had managed to grasp what had just happened. A voice came from above. "Your plot ends here, Lysias." Constance's gaze snapped to the source of the voice. Her real Hubert dropped smoothly to the floor from the ceiling, and she glanced up to see that there were indeed discreet pathways up there above the chandelier. Two more people dropped down below him, clad in serious expressions and Vestra uniforms. She recognized them as some of Hubert's specialists. They silently took up positions on either side of Lysias. Although Lysias seemed unable to turn around or move at all, he looked to be strangely unfazed by this sudden shift of the scales. His mouth wore a calm smile as Hubert walked up behind him, and the only sign that he had just been in such great pain was the band of tiny glittering beads of sweat just below his hairline. "You managed to infiltrate your own home," he said. "Bravo." Ignoring Lysias completely, Hubert walked past him and knelt by Constance with a deeply concerned expression on his face. "Are you all right?" She swallowed as she looked up at him, as she took in his weary face, his uniform speckled with dirt and decorated with several tears in the cloth, his usually so well-combed hair now a mess by his ordinary standards. And she took in the caring but slightly hesitant look in his eyes, the silent question behind the one he had spoken. "Are we all right?" "I will be," she said. He looked into her eyes for a moment longer, then let his gaze move downward to take in the gag hanging loosely around her neck and the ropes tied around her body. Something resolute came over his expression as he looked up at her face again. "I know how to remove the curse," he said. "This will all be over soon." Her eyes widened. He had found a way? Before she could ask any questions, he stood up again and turned to face Lysias while his captor sneered back at him. For a silent moment, Hubert simply studied the other man's face. There was something almost remorseful in his eyes, which she found odd under the circumstances. "And you," he said, "will be brought to the dungeons for now." Lysias' gaze was amused as it met Hubert's. "No," he said. "I think not." His hands, which Constance now noticed had been clenched into tight fists, began to glow in the telltale violet of elder magic. Hubert saw it as well. "Disarm him," he quickly commanded his specialists even as he himself extended his arms toward Lysias' chest, but before the other two men could even begin to react to the order, a burst of darkness exploded from Lysias and expanded outward until, a mere second later, the entire room was completely shrouded in black fog. Hubert cried out nearby, and then a spell zipped past right above Constance's head. She immediately laid down and pressed herself as flat against the floor as she possibly could. He shouldn't have been able to break out of that spell. She should know Hubert had once locked her in it, and she had been completely unable to move her body until he released her. But clearly Lysias had somehow escaped the spell's grasp and retaken the upper hand in an instant, because she could hear the battle playing out nearby, could hear the rushed footsteps, the sound of spells flying through the air and exclamations from the mages as they fought a battle in complete darkness, and from what she could tell, Lysias had not yet been defeated. 3 men, of which 2 had been working as spies, assassins, and fighters for the Vestra family for many years, and 1 was Hubert von Vestra himself, could not defeat a single Agarthan. She briefly thought back to their battle in Shamhala, where Sylvain and Happy had just barely managed to hold Lysias off as Constance tried to take over the Titaness. Constance had never fought Lysias herself. Was he truly so capable that even Hubert and his best specialists were at a disadvantage against him? She remembered what he had told her just a moment earlier. I am the reincarnation of one of history's most powerful warriors. My powers were bestowed on me by ancient Agarthan gods, for the purpose of avenging our people. The dark fog began to evaporate, and finally Constance could discern shapes in the room. And while Lysias' confession might explain some of his great power, the moment that she identified all of them, she realized that there was another very important reason why Lysias had yet to be defeated. Hubert was not fighting at the edge of his capabilities. She saw how capably he warped between positions in the room as he evaded Lysias' attacks, and how quickly and easily he brought up shields to defend himself when he had no other option. A few times, he fired spells of his own, but she recognized them as mere paralysis magic, and Lysias easily dodged them even as he had to deal with the 2 specialists at the same time. He had to fight 3 people at once, and yet he was holding his own. Constance had seen Hubert fight enough times to know that this was not how he usually performed. Even with what Linhard had told her about how part of Hubert's powers were temporarily locked away in the bracelets around her wrists, he was behaving strangely. He was holding back. However, as she continued to helplessly watch the battle play out, she realized that Lysias was also holding back against Hubert. Even after he eventually managed to take out one of the specialists, snapping his neck with little more than the flick of a wrist in the air, he consistently sent only non-lethal spells in Hubert's direction. They want Hubert alive, she realized. They still needed him likely in order to be able to take over his body for good this time, and so Lysias was trying to incapacitate him, but not severely harm him. But why was Hubert doing the same for Lysias? What possible reason could there be to keep Lysias alive? After the first specialist had been erased from the equation, Hubert began to visibly struggle to hold his own against Lysias' barrage of attacks. A spell struck his arm and he grunted in pain, but he still only retorted with non-lethal spells. "Kill him," she heard herself shout in a desperate voice. "Hubert, what are you doing? Kill him." At that, Lysias actually laughed, an unrestrained, almost childish laughter that echoed against the walls as he gleefully continued to fire attacks at both Hubert and the remaining specialist. His movement pattern was like that of an expert dancer as he dodged the attacks and set up shields around himself while blasting absolutely lethal spells in the direction of the specialist and paralysis magic at Hubert. "So you do have another weakness," Lysias called to him, sounding slightly winded but still full of energy. "You would sacrifice your own life, as well as the future of the Empire, for her?" Constance frowned, gaze trying to follow along with the rapid movements as her brain processed his taunts. "For her? What would?" she gasped. If her hand hadn't been locked against her side, she would have covered her mouth. Could it be that taking Lysias alive was necessary to free her of the curse? "Hubert," she exclaimed. "Please. Forget the curse, kill him. I will manage." She was already on her way to conquering her fears, and if she succeeded, her willpower would always be strong enough to withstand the curse. There was no good reason to risk everything simply for a chance to safely remove the curse. Hubert gritted his teeth, but did not speak. He set up a shield in front of his co-combatant, only just managing to block another lethal spell from Lysias. But she could see that he was growing tired, and meanwhile, Lysias seemed almost luminescent with magical energy. And then something happened which tipped the scales in an instant. Another figure, a woman dressed in dark Gremory clothing, teleported into the room right beside the remaining specialist, and before either he or Hubert could react, she had fired off a burst of electricity so strong into the man's head that he collapsed immediately, dead before he hit the floor. Her appearance seemed to catch even Lysias off guard, as he froze in place for a moment. However, he quickly regained himself, acknowledging the woman with only a curt nod. Now facing off two foes alone, Hubert seemed to realize that he was at a major disadvantage. He cast a powerful elder spell, lethal in its total darkness, in the direction of the Gremory, but she blinked out of existence and appeared again behind him. He ducked away, creating a shielding barrier around himself before bringing out two daggers from within his coat. Panting, he leaned his back against the nearby wall as both Lysias and the woman stalked toward him. "No!" Constance called, trying to wriggle out of her ropes, but it was just as useless as all the other times that she had tried. Hubert's gaze met hers for a second, dark and determined and completely exhausted, and she could see that he was trying to reassure her. He knew just as well as she did that they did not intend to kill him, at least not right away. There might be a later chance before it was too late, because for now, he knew that he had played his hand and lost. "Don't you just love it when your prey comes to you?" Lysias asked the woman, only barely out of breath. "Indeed," she replied dryly, before addressing Hubert. "Where is your trickster friend this time, Vestra? Did he tire of your foolishness?" Still panting heavily, Hubert dropped his daggers to the floor and slid down against the wall as Lysias laid his palm against the barrier around him. It trembled for a moment, then evaporated in a cloud of dark smoke. Blue sparks danced around the woman's hands. Constance recognized it as lightning magic even in the moment before she fired it. "No," she shouted, not even thinking as she tried to wriggle free of her bonds. "I beg of you, please, no. You may cause irreparable harm." The woman did not listen to her pleas. The spell struck Hubert's forehead, and he was out cold. His head lolled to the side, eyes falling closed. Constance bit down her impulse to cry out again. Such a rash action would achieve nothing at this point. She could only hope that Hubert was not permanently harmed by the lightning that had been channeled straight into his brain, and that the palace healers would be able to heal him later. But she could not help the tears that desperately wanted to press their way out from behind her eyes. Lysias nudged Hubert's foot with his toes. "You didn't kill him, did you?" The woman scoffed and placed her hands at her sides. "Don't worry, you shall have your place in the sun. It is a mere temporary paralysis of the brain. He will remain unconscious for at least 6 hours." Lysias nodded. He stared at Hubert as he spoke again, softly this time. "You came back. You need me," the woman said simply. Then she turned toward him. "Now hurry up and transform back. We have several more targets to take out." Lysias glanced in Constance's direction. She immediately cast down her eyes, knowing that if she were to have any chance at all at saving Hubert, she needed to stay conscious and out of harm's way. "Fine," he sighed. She looked back at him just in time to see him reach into a pocket of his assassin's garments and bring out a thin glass vial that he held between his thumb and forefinger. Within it was a dark, almost black liquid, blood. Constance watched in a mixture of fascination and horror as Lysias closed his eyes and began to speak in the Agarthan language. She was brought back to the night before the wedding, when Hubert had performed the elder ritual on her. However, Hubert had required a reference from a dark tome, while Lysias apparently knew the spell by heart and had no issues with speaking the language itself. She had thought at the time that Hubert's Agarthan sounded surprisingly fluid and natural, but it was nothing compared to Lysias' mastery of the language. It seemed to flow as easily and simply as a mother tongue, leading Constance to wonder whether such was in fact the case. As he spoke, a glowing elder magic circle appeared on the floor beneath him, and sparks of magic came into existence all around his body, illuminating his features with an eerie violet light. The air around them seemed to grow thick and heavy, and Constance felt a sense of foreboding settling over her like a dark cloud. This was clearly powerful elder magic, akin to nothing she had seen before. Lysias continued to chant, his voice growing louder and more intense with each passing moment. The liquid in the vial began to bubble and boil, as if it was alive and fighting against the magic that surrounded it. Lysias continued to speak, his voice growing louder and more forceful, as if he was trying to overcome the resistance of the blood. Constance could see the strain on his face, could see sweat beginning to bead on his forehead again. But he did not falter, did not waver, and soon the blood in the vial began to glow with an eerie blue light. After a few beats, he opened his eyes. Constance jerked back at the sight, where before there had simply been blackness, now his eyes almost seemed to be pure black liquid, contained by some invisible barrier that stopped the liquid from seeping out and running down his face. His hands were shaking slightly as he lifted the vial to his lips. He hesitated for just a moment before tipping it back, and Constance watched in horror as he swallowed the thick, viscous liquid in one gulp. For a moment, as he lowered the vial and licked a trace of blood from his lips, everything was silent. Then a strangled cry escaped his mouth, and he fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His veins lit up in the same blue color as the blood had done a moment ago. It began near his chest before rapidly spreading across his body like glowing pathways on a map, reminding her of the magical veins of the city of Shamhala. She could see his skin changing, becoming paler and more translucent, while his hair turned black as midnight. His features twisted and contorted, his eyes narrowing and the angles of his face sharpening. Finally, the blue light faded, and Constance found herself staring at a perfect copy of her fiancé. The man in front of her had the same sharp features and dark hair, but his eyes held a glint of something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. It was not the love and kindness that she had come to know in Hubert, but a coldness and calculation that made her feel like she was in the presence of a predator. Lysias stood up, still holding his chest in pain, but his eyes were fixed on Constance, unblinking and intense. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively jerked back, causing him to chuckle. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but just as he did, a loud bang echoed through the palace, shaking the very foundations of the building. Lysias froze and turned to the woman, who had knelt by the real Hubert's unconscious shape. She looked up, and their eyes locked onto each other. "Is that?" "No," she replied. "I came alone." "Then we need to investigate," Lysias said in an urgent voice, already heading toward the door. The Gremory rose to her feet. "What about her?" she asked as her gaze slid over to Constance. He stopped, glancing at Constance over his shoulder. She held her breath. She didn't know how she would get herself and Hubert out of this, but if both Lysias and his companion left the room, that might be a promising start in the very least. Trying to make herself look as small and helpless as possible, she silently prayed to the goddess as she waited for Lysias to make a decision. She has no magic and no way to escape her bonds, he concluded, and Hubert will be incapacitated for hours. They will both be here when we return. After a brief pause, the woman nodded. Cast a barrier on the door, as an additional precaution. Constance breathed a small sigh of relief as the two Agarthans left the room, closing and locking the door behind them. However, the relief was short-lived as she remembered her circumstances. Bound, magicless, and with an unconscious Hubert who might or might not be severely harmed. Not to mention the fact that she had no idea what that loud noise had been, and how soon Lysias might return. She needed to think of a plan, and she needed to do it quickly. Somehow, she had to free herself, aid Hubert, and escape together with him so that they could regroup and come up with a new strategy for how to retake the palace. The question was, how in the world was she supposed to do that? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something she could use to cut the ropes. However, all she could see were ornate furnishings and decorations, nothing that could serve as a tool. She tried to wiggle her hands and feet, hoping that maybe the ropes had loosened, but they remained tight and unforgiving. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly to calm herself as she tried to focus. She couldn't allow despair and fear to take over. The situation may seem impossible, but she needed to stay strong and find a way to escape. If Lysias and the Gremory believed that she was helpless, then she had to use that belief to her advantage. As she opened her eyes, her gaze drifted to the stained glass window nearby, which was now illuminated by morning sunlight streaming in. Something about the colors and patterns in the glass caught her attention and sparked an idea in her mind. She looked at Hubert's unconscious form, then back at the window. It was a small glimmer of hope in the darkness of the situation, and there was no telling whether it would work. However, if it did work, it would give her an advantage of which Lysias was not aware, an advantage which might allow her to do the so-called impossible. In truth, impossible was simply a lousy excuse invented by narrow-minded fools who were too lazy to look past their own biased worldviews, and in his haste to investigate the unexpected sound, Lysias had made a foolish assumption that could end up costing him dearly. Constance took a deep breath to steel herself. Then she began to wriggle forward on the floor. Chapter 23, The True Enemy, PT2. If you wish to do the impossible, you simply need to surpass whatever expectations have been set for you. Lysias expected her to be helpless, bound and without her magic, and so, those were the expectations which she would need to shatter in order to succeed. As she crawled toward the shapes of colored light on the floor ahead, Constance attempted to mentally prepare herself for what was to come. Her immediate instinct even now was to boldly proclaim to herself how utterly, completely she would crush Lysias as soon as she laid her hands on him. However, she knew that in order for her plan to work, she needed to shift her mindset. She needed to steer away from such thoughts and place herself in the mercy of another power. Her awkward shuffling forward was already tiring her out, and she could feel the floor scrape painfully against her knees. She did not even wish to imagine how ridiculous she must look at the moment, a helpless larva, roped together all the way from her shoulders down to her knees, pathetically pushing herself forward with what little momentum she could manage. Just a little further, now. She stopped short just outside of the colored pattern, swallowing as she took in the red shapes of light above the blues and greens, surrounded by yellow, almost like flames. No. She closed her eyes tightly against the wave of vertigo that came upon her at the thought. In an attempt to distract herself, she thought back to Linhard's sessions with her, his magical orb of light behind the sheet by the window, the warmth emanating from Lysithea's fire magic nearby. It cannot harm me. Intellectually, she knew that this was true. The light the sun could not cause her any true harm. The harm lay in her own mind, a mind that, if not kept under close check, could lure dark Constance forward and out of the shadows. But it all existed solely within her mind. While that thought was not enough to rid herself of her woes completely, it did manage to reassure her somewhat. She opened her eyes with a shivering breath. Yes. Everything else notwithstanding, the only thing that could harm her or Hubert in this room at the moment was herself. She had come too far to give up now, and she would not allow herself to falter when her friends needed her most. She would face this challenge head-on, with all the courage and determination she could muster. She would do it for Hubert, for her friends, and for herself. And with that thought firmly in her mind, Constance von Novelli set out to do the impossible. She began to crawl again, exhaling gently as she felt the first rays of the sun fall on her skin. The glass seemed to block out most of its strength, a relief that made it possible for her to carry on her movement until nearly all of her body was covered in the colored light, yet the light still noticeably warmed her. She held the memory of Linhard's light and Lysithea's warmth within her mind as she once again closed her eyes, breathing in and out as calmly as she could muster, even as she felt herself shrink in on herself. I am Constance von Novelli. She was Constance von Novelli, and she would not give in to Lysia's curse. Not this time. But the light. The flames, the blood. No. Not that. She shivered, sensing the darkness around the edges threatening to overtake her. With a faint whimper, she curled her body into a fetal position. Who am I to believe that I can save anyone? That I can achieve anything, in such a sorry, helpless state? Constance shook her head. I am not helpless, she whispered, her voice so weak it was nearly unrecognizable. I have come this far. I have saved Hubert's life before, I can do it again. What am I thinking? It was only because of me that his life was threatened in the first place. Without me, Hubert would. He would be lonely, she hurried to say, interrupting her own thought process before it could begin to spiral. The sunlight may not be harsh here, but it was slowly trying to whittle her down. No, wait. Not the sun, herself. The only enemy in this room was herself. He has Lady Edelgard. Has he not proven again and again how his emperor will always come first? I am disposable. He nearly killed me without a second thought. But he did not, she whispered, wishing that she could wrap her arms around herself. He did not kill me, and he does not find me disposable. Without me, she swallowed, forcing herself to push onward. He would live a selfless life with little joy. He enjoys spending time with me. No, her other side whined. No one truly does. I am a burden, even now. I am simply lying here, pathetic and weak, while the lives of those most dear to me are threatened. Hubert chose not to kill Lysias because of me, because he wished to free me of the curse. And because of that choice, he is now. He is. The image of a slumped Hubert over by the other wall invaded her mind without her consent, and a painful twang in her chest revealed her other side's deep fears to her, not only that Hubert might be dying because of her, but also that she was too weak and useless to do anything to stop it. That she was too small, too helpless. I can help him, she said, raising her voice somewhat above her previous whispers. She still did not dare to open her eyes for fear of succumbing to the sight of the sunlight above. I am not helpless. I am not. She paused with a frown as she considered the meaning behind her own thoughts. Perhaps it was unfair to call her other self the enemy, when that part of her was so clearly terrified and in need of support. In need of someone to hear her fears, to acknowledge them, and reassure her that everything would be all right in the end. No. It will not. It will never be all right again. It has not been, not for ages. Not for many years. Yes, it will be, she said, relaxing her muscles slightly. I have friends who love me, who support me. I am valuable. Regardless of. Please. Regardless of my achievements, she finished, then immediately choked out a sob in response to her own words. Regardless of whether she drew for air. Whether you restore House Novelli, or unravel the mysteries of magic, or create the most extraordinary spell anyone has ever seen. That is not where your self-worth lies. Then where else? What else do I have to offer? You do not need to offer anything, she tried, sniveling, and wishing that she could have dried her tears with her hands. She needed to be strong for her other side, to support her. Do not say it. Please, do not say it. Do not lie to me. It is not a lie, she whispered, relieved to have been interrupted by her own thoughts before she could finish the sentence. Oh, but it is. You do not love me. You despise me. You wish that I had never been born. And rightfully so, I ruined your life. Ruined everything. And for that, you shall never forgive me. You shall never forgive yourself. Constance gasped for air. Her control was slipping, the darkness, the curse, was hovering above her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She did not know what to say. It was true, part of it, she had despised herself. Had sworn to set things right before she would even consider forgiving herself. But to have it so clearly stated by her other side, by her own thoughts, but still in a definitively explicit manner made her view it in a different light than she had once done. These demands that she had placed on herself. That she needed to restore House Novelli to its former glory in order to even deserve to exist. If placed on anyone else, they would have seemed ridiculously excessive. And to place them on someone who was already down, who was already hurt and alone and afraid. I am just human, she said, limbs trembling from the exhaustion of struggling against both the curse and her own devastating self-doubt. You are just human. You wished to be rid of me. You always did. Even Hubert searched for a way to heal you that would not completely eradicate me, but you? You longed for a magical solution. You wished to forget me entirely. Constance bit into her bottom lip, face scrunched up as she tried not to cry. How could she have allowed herself to do this for so long? To allow herself to believe that her own self-worth lay solely in her achievements? To believe that she was her own enemy? I was wrong, she said to herself as she curled into an imperfect ball on the floor. I do not wish to be rid of you. It is true, I may wish that things had happened differently, but it is not truly your fault. None of it is. Yuri had tried to tell her this. And she had pretended to listen, tricked herself into believing that she already knew what he had told her, while the truth was that she had severely failed to convince all of herself that she truly wasn't to blame for the downfall of her family. She had said the words, but they had rung hollow. You were still a child, she continued. You did not understand what you had heard, not fully. And even if you had, What could you have done? It was much, much larger than you. And no one has expected you to carry the world on your shoulders, only you expect that from yourself. Her other self was quiet for a moment, and Constance nearly believed that she had succeeded in comforting herself. Then, the other side returned again. If I cannot repent for what I did, then what do I have to live for? The thought brought her real pain, enough to make her groan and curl together even further in an attempt to escape the thought itself. What she had to live for? Surely there were many things in life still worth exploring. For the joy of life, she whispered, and new experiences, and magic, and food, and your friends, and Hubert. My apologies, her other self interrupted solemnly, for giving you the false conception that I should deserve any of those joys. Constance shook her head. You live to heal, she whispered, her voice shaking but determined. You live to grow and to learn, and to find happiness in spite of the pain you've experienced. You live to love and be loved, and to forge a better future for yourself and those around you. You do not need to repent to be worthy of life, you are worthy simply by being alive. You deserve joy as much as anyone else. The other side seemed to consider her words, and for a moment, it seemed as though Constance had found a tenuous equilibrium. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to bask in the colored light that still washed over her. And I shall prove it to you. She could feel her other self hesitate still, reluctant to take any of it in. Relaxing her muscles as much as she dared while still in the sunlight, she imagined herself embracing a smaller Constance, the terrified, lonely self that had been with her for years now. In her mind, she wrapped her arms around that self and held her close to her chest. I understand how terrifying it is, she said, but you are not alone, you have me. I shall be there for you. In the darkness, in the light, always. She would be there. Never again would she treat herself so unkindly as she had done. We must be strong, Constance murmured, more to herself than to the other side. We need to face this challenge together, as one. We will save Hubert, and we will find a way to break this curse with or without Lysias. We will do it not because we need to prove ourselves or to repent for past mistakes, but because it is what we want, and because we care for those around us. As the words left her lips, she felt a calm stillness settle within her. She had expected her other self to argue to continue bullying herself, but now, everything was silent. However, the fear and self-doubt still lingered at the edges of her mind, and she knew that she was far from the finish line. Constance opened her eyes, pushing through the lingering tendrils of fear that clung to her. She looked up at the sunlight streaming through the colored glass, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, it did not bring her terror or despair. It was simply light. Light that gave her a sense of unease, yes, but not enough to call forth the curse. Willpower, she thought with a trembling smile growing on her lips. Perhaps there is more than just one kind. Trying to focus on the memory of Linhard's light, of Yuri's light, and thinking back to all those times by the interior pond in Morphais, she aimed her intentions at the force above her, phrasing a question within her mind. Tell me. What do you want? The beams of light, which were barely reaching through the stained glass, still held her in its gentle and warm embrace. If she had expected some kind of sign from nature, she was clearly mistaken. The sunlight was above her both literally and metaphorically. It bowed to no mortal being, deigned to answer no pleas. As such, even the goddess might be more likely to heed her wishes. But she pushed on, knowing that it must be possible. Your warmth, she thought. While I have believed it to be harmful many times, that is not truly the case, is it? You do not wish to harm me, or you would not be shining your light on me now. She paused, considering. Light and warmth. It reminded her of white magic. The warmth that spread through her as she was healed by the light. You do not wish to harm me, you wish to heal me. To free me. She might have imagined it, but for a moment, she could have sworn that she felt the warmth increase in strength. Sighing softly, she raised her chin to meet the sun's beams fully with her face. So free me, she whispered, relaxing her muscles as she let her eyes flutter closed. I shall receive your aid with gratitude. For a moment, nothing happened. Constance breathed calmly, waiting, hoping that the sun would answer her plea. Then, she felt a tingling sensation that began at her fingertips and spread throughout her entire body. The warmth intensified, enveloping her like a protective cocoon. It was as if the sun was embracing her, acknowledging her request and responding in kind. And as the sunlight continued to bathe her in its comforting warmth, she could feel the ropes around her body begin to heat up. Constance held her breath as she slowly opened her eyes, uncertain of what to expect. Would the heat from the ropes burn her skin? She braced herself for the pain, but it never came. Instead, she felt the ropes become more pliable, the fibers beginning to weaken and unravel. They began to smolder, the fibers charring and turning to ash under the sun's focused power, although she could barely feel the heat against her. The ropes around her continued to heat up and weaken until they finally snapped, falling away from her body in a cascade of frayed, charred strands. Constance blinked in disbelief, flexing her now free hands and legs. The impossible had just happened. She was free of her bonds. Now, she had to help Hubert. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs unsteady but growing stronger with each passing moment. She looked toward the other side of the room, her gaze falling upon Hubert's unconscious form, slumped back against the wall. Her heart clenched at the sight, but she knew that she couldn't afford to waste any time. She rushed to his side, searching for his pulse with 2 fingers pressed up against his throat. It was weak, but it was there. Gently, she laid him down on the ground, her heart pounding in her chest as she examined him for any further injuries. She could feel her own pulse throbbing in her temples, but she forced herself to stay calm and focused. Hubert's life was in her hands now, and she could not afford to let her emotions get the better of her. She inspected his body, searching for any signs of harm beyond the electrical shock that he had sustained during the fight with Lysias and Bias. If she had only had her magic, she could have healed some of his injuries easily, without having to risk moving him first. As she unbuttoned and opened his coat, her fingers brushed against a pocket sewn into the fabric on the inside, right by the edge of the coat. When she pulled her fingers back, a crumpled, tattered note fell out and landed on the floor. Puzzled, she picked it up and unfolded it, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized her own handwriting. "Please, do not doubt my feelings for you. Please, do not close yourself off. If you must fly, my blackbird, please fly to me. Your sunshine." Tears welled up in Constance's eyes as she read the note. This was a torn-off piece of a love letter she had written to him years ago, hoping to reach through to him and make him understand that her feelings for him were sincere and true. She had almost forgotten the words she had written, but they came back to her quickly now, along with memories of scribbling them out at the end of the letter. At that time, she hadn't been aware that her crow was Hubert von Vestra, but that detail made her words no less meaningful. And while she may not have known his identity, Hubert had always been aware of hers. He had known who she was, and although he had rejected her confession at the time out of a misguided fear that she might not love his true self, he had clearly taken her words to heart and chosen to carry them with him. The realization that he had kept this particular letter close to his heart perhaps even for years, considering its tattered state, struck her like a bolt of lightning, and she could not hold back her tears any longer. They streamed down her cheeks, dropping onto the parchment and blurring the ink. Hubert von Vestra. Her stoic, coldly efficient assassin of a fiancé. That man had carried proof of her love with him all these years. She allowed herself a moment to give in to her emotions, a mixture of joy and pain filling her chest as she clutched the note to her chest. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. But she knew that she was pressed for time, and so after all too brief of a moment, she sniffled and wiped away her tears. Now wasn't the time for sentimentality. She needed to help Hubert, and the only way she knew how to do so was on the other side of the room. After gently returning the note to the inside pocket of his coat, she gathered her strength and wrapped her arms around his chest, using every ounce of her energy to drag his limp body across the floor. Hubert was a tall and therefore heavy man, presenting her with quite the challenge. When she finally reached the window, her muscles ached, and her breathing was labored. As she stepped into the sunlight again, she felt the familiar anxiety creep up toward her. She took a moment to inhale and exhale deeply, mentally cradling her other side within her arms as she waited for the looming horrors to subside. "I am here. I will not allow anything to harm you." After a few seconds, the darkness withdrew far enough that she dared to return her attention to Hubert, kneeling beside his unconscious form. His face was pale, and his breathing was shallow, the electric shock to his brain having taken its toll on him. Constance reached out to the sun once more, and this time, she felt a connection almost immediately. It was a strange, new thing to her, an altogether different sensation than all of her previous experiences with magic. The sun's power was not hers to command. It was a gift, a wish to warm and heal, and she was but a conduit for that wish. The sunlight seemed to focus around her, its beams trembling in expectation as she gently guided it toward Hubert. It was as though she had earned the sun's trust, and now it heeded her call that much more eagerly. Was this what it felt like for the Morphean children when they so easily skipped atop gusts of wind from rooftop to rooftop? "Please," she whispered, "help me heal him. Help me save him." The light grew warmer, the golden rays shifting and coalescing around Hubert's body. Constance could feel the gentle warmth spreading through her as well, as if the sun were trying to comfort her in her distress. She hesitated for a moment before she gave in to an impulse and tentatively placed her hands on Hubert's chest, allowing the healing energy to flow from her fingertips into his body. She could sense the sun's desire to heal, to nurture life, and she welcomed it wholeheartedly. She watched with bated breath, feeling new tears gently stream down her cheeks as the light worked its magic, and slowly, color returned to Hubert's face, and the tension in his muscles seemed to ease. Soon, the sunlight dimmed, the sun having heeded her pleas and done its work. Moments passed that felt like an eternity, and then, at last, Hubert's eyes fluttered open. Constance sobbed out in relief. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." His gaze met her tear-streaked face, and he looked between her and the window with confusion in his eyes. "Sunshine," he mumbled, his gaze drifting to the bracelets still on her wrists. A soft smile came upon her lips. It was unclear whether he was speaking of the sunlight that fell on the two of them, or whether he was simply referring to her with the pet name he had given her, but she understood the sentiment all the same. "Yes, my blackbird," Constance replied, her voice coming out weak. "I am here." Overcome with emotion, and her heart warming at the memory of the love letter pressed against his chest, Constance leaned in and pressed her lips against Hubert's. He stiffened at first, his eyes wide with surprise, but as the seconds passed, he began to return the kiss, his hand coming up to cradle the side of her face. Constance could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest, her skin tingling from the contact. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget everything: the curse, the looming darkness, and the struggles that had led them to this point. But the reprieve could not last. The sun kept warming her from above, and as they kissed, Constance felt the shadows begin to creep up on her. The anxiety gnawed at the edges of her mind, the curse's insidious tendrils beginning to wrap around her heart once more, threatening to consume her. She tried to ignore it, to keep it at bay, but she couldn't quite manage to shake the feeling of impending doom that seemed to loom over her. Her body tensed, the fear and unease flooding through her veins, and she heard a small whimper slip out between her lips. Hubert, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the change in her before she could even think to warn him. Hands darting up to grab her wrists, he pushed her off him and away from the sunlight, his body acting as a protective barrier as he pinned her wrists to the floor on either side of her head, searching her eyes for any hint of the darkness taking over. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her heart raced from the dizzying whirlwind of emotions. She could still feel the ghost of Hubert's lips pressed against hers. Seeming to judge that he'd managed to halt the process in time, Hubert allowed his gaze to dart upward toward the window. Releasing one of her wrists, he reached up and flicked the curtain to the side with a gust of magical wind. The heavy fabric was pulled across the window, plunging the room into a dim, shadowy light. "Hubert," she whispered, causing him to immediately gaze down upon her again. His hand returned to her wrist. "How?" he asked softly, searching her face. "The bracelets." Constance struggled to catch her breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I pleaded with the sun," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I asked it to help me heal you, and it wished to heal, so it heeded my pleas." Hubert's confusion was evident on his face, but he didn't question her further. Instead, he studied her for a moment before letting out a soft, disbelieving chuckle. He shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. "Will you ever cease to surprise me?" he murmured, a note of wonder in his voice. Constance felt her cheeks heat against her will. She squirmed beneath him, taken by the intensity of his gaze as it slowly shifted into something deeper. His gaze flicked from her eyes to her lips, his grip tightening around her wrists. He seemed torn, the urgency of their situation just barely holding him back, a sentiment she could very much relate to. Despite the danger they faced, a part of her yearned to once again feel his touch, his warmth. She wished he would lean in again, that they could forget the world and lose themselves in each other. But before either of them could make the first move to close the distance between them, a loud bang echoed through the palace, causing them both to be jolted out of their private moment. The noise was distant, but it was enough to bring them back to the present. Sitting back in a crouch, Hubert pulled her up by her wrists, his gaze holding hers in a vice grip. "I am going to ask you a question," he said, "and I need you to answer sincerely, with the knowledge that your reply may have a decisive impact on whether or not we survive to see another dawn." Constance swallowed, understanding slowly dawning on her even before he could ask his question. She nodded. "Have you learned how to stave off the curse?" As always, her first instinct was to confidently boast of her control and might, but she knew that Hubert would immediately see through it, diminishing her chances of actually being of help in the coming battle. So she channeled part of her other side, drawing from that self's natural modesty. "Not fully," she said reluctantly. "My method is not reliable, and I cannot know whether it would work in the midst of battle. I do however believe that I could hold it off for a while longer than I used to." She looked to her other self within her, sensing the insecurity radiating through her body. "I shall not leave you by the wayside," she assured herself. "We are one." Hubert took her tepid assurances in with a concerned wrinkle between his brows. "It shall have to be enough, I'm afraid." He lowered his gaze to the bracelets, smoothing his thumbs over the metal. "I'll need these for someone else." She tensed, holding her breath as he murmured an incantation in Agarthan. Sparks of elder magic swirled around her wrists, and with a simplicity that bordered on the inconceivable, the bracelets unlocked and tumbled into his lap. Constance gasped for air as an almost overpowering rush of magical energy flooded into her all at once. The world burst into vibrant color, and she could feel every thread of reality at her fingertips. She instinctively reached out with her lightning magic, letting out a choked laugh as she sensed the living beings in the palace, and the area mapped itself out in her mind with a mystical but familiar clarity. Stumbling to her feet with a mad grin, she held out her hands to her sides and spun around, letting sparks of ice and light and electricity dance along with her as she took in a deep breath that seemed to evaporate every last bit of weariness from her body. "AHH," she exclaimed, then fell into a gleeful laughter as she came to a stop, her gaze focusing on Hubert's shape. He stood up as well, slowly, keeping a close eye on her, but she was too exhilarated to admonish him for his instinctive suspicion. "Hubert. I can breathe. I can see again, I can. Oh," her smile trembled and faded away, exchanged for a pout as her vision blurred from tears. With a sob, she threw her arms around herself and shook her head. "It has been so long. I had nearly." How long had it been? Weeks, months? At first, she had been exhausted from the loss of her magic. Eventually, she adapted and found new ways to live in the world, almost forgetting the exhilarating feeling of magical power coursing through her. Now, experiencing it all again felt like returning home after a long journey. The sensation of coming home filled her with a mix of sorrow and joy that she struggled to contain, even with her restored magical strength. Through her tears, she saw Hubert move toward her slowly, as though approaching a wild animal. When he came close enough that she could smell his scent, she leaned in toward him, which seemed to grant him enough courage to wrap his arms around her and pull her against his chest. "I am sorry," he murmured as he gently stroked her back, "for all of the suffering which I have doubtlessly caused you. I shall make no excuses for my actions, and I understand if you shall never be able to trust me again." Constance let out a shaky breath, her emotions still a whirlwind within her. She leaned into Hubert's embrace, feeling the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing against her. The combination of joy and sorrow still tugged at her heart, but the comfort of his arms was undeniable. Her tears began to slow, and she raised her eyes to meet his gaze. "I believe I shall," she said. She felt that her words were true, although they had much to work through together, and although he would need to show her a different side in order for her to fully come to trust him in the future, her instinct was still to have faith in him. Now was not the time to talk more deeply about how they should move forward. However, she needed him to understand that he had hurt her, and that this was not the end of the discussion. "Allow me to be clear," she continued before he could reply. "Your actions have been truly hurtful. You have used me, lied to me and harmed me both physically and emotionally." However, she exhaled sharply. "I understand that you did what you believed was necessary, however misguided. And if you can learn to trust me, and prove to me henceforth that you truly care about me, then I believe I can forgive you. I cannot forget the pain, but I can forgive." Hubert's grip around her tightened. She could see his jaw muscles clench. "I understand. I swear I will do everything in my power to make amends." Constance nodded. She believed him, she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "See to it that you do." Stepping out of his embrace, she raised a hand beside her head and called forth a trembling ball of deadly electricity within her palm. "First, however, I do believe we have an impostor to take care of. I shall personally ensure that Lysias never harms any of us again." She was already heading for the door when Hubert grabbed her wrist, forcing her to come to a halt. She instinctively wanted to jerk her hand out of his grip, half afraid that he would steal her magic away again, but when nothing happened, she allowed herself to relax and look back at him over her shoulder. "Listen to me," he said in a low voice, keeping his gaze carefully level with hers. "I understand your thirst for revenge, but I cannot allow you to kill Lysias, and not merely because we need him to remove the curse." She scowled, annoyed at his unfathomable insistence to keep Lysias alive. "Why ever should I hold myself back?" she asked, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "That disgusting creature has plagued us for long enough. He does not deserve a death at the hands of Agnelli, but then, there is little which he does deserve except for eternal torment and pain." Hubert smiled wryly, seeming torn between anger, sorrow, and dark irony as he visibly struggled to keep his facial expression calm. "Bearing your limited understanding of the situation in mind, I suppose you can be expected to condemn him as such. However, before we leave this room and go after him, there is something you must know." He let his hand fall away from her wrist as he took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristically nervous manner. Constance's eyebrows lowered in suspicion as she waited for him to explain. "Lysias is not just any commander of Thales," Hubert said, gaze fixed on a spot on the floor as he spoke. "He is the result of a series of rituals so dark, so gruesome, that it caused him to become mad in the process. It gave him unnatural powers and capabilities, including an exceptional proclivity for blood magic. And yet, he remembers nothing of it. He believes that he is the reincarnation of Nemesis, granted such power by ancient Agarthan gods, but that is merely a lie spun by Thales. In reality, Lysias is a tragic victim of those who slither in the dark, brutally violated and deluded in order to serve Thales' wicked goals." Pausing briefly, Hubert looked up and met her gaze. His smile had long since faded, now exchanged for a pained expression. "Lysias is Lord Lucas von Hresvelg, broken to pieces and rebuilt so thoroughly that he is barely recognizable even to me. But I know for a fact that it is him, and I must have faith that he can be redeemed. Which is why, no matter what happens today, he needs to be kept alive at any and all cost." Constance stared at him, half expecting him to scoff and roll his eyes, asking how she could possibly be so naive as to believe such an obviously false story. But he simply gazed at her with that pained look in his eyes, waiting for her reaction. She did not wish to believe what he had told her, but she saw no reason for Hubert to lie about such a harrowing revelation, and she knew that he would not tell her this unless he was absolutely certain that it was the truth. His voice, which had been filled with emotion and a rare display of faith, further strengthened her belief that he was being sincere. This was clearly more than just a mission to stop a threat, it was deeply personal for him. Constance recalled what she had read about Hubert's trauma from the death of Lord Lucas and the other Hresvelgs, how it had haunted him and shaped his life. How it clung to him even today, in the shape of his all-consuming fear of losing Lady Edelgard and the trauma of in his own mind failing to save those whom he had sworn to protect with his life. And there was Lord Lucas, a sweet, charming 7-year-old whose worst crime had been to swindle an entire cookie jar from the kitchen, who was reduced to a madly blathering shell of himself before being taken away by his tormentors, to be put to death at Thale's hands. His trauma had blossomed due to the knowledge that he had done nothing to save the Hresvelg children from a painful death. She could only imagine the pain and turmoil he must be experiencing now, after learning that one of those children hadn't actually died, but had instead been further experimented on and abused for years without Hubert's, or Lady Edelgard's, knowledge. Oh. Lady Edelgard. Did she know, or was she still oblivious to Lysia's identity? Constance felt a painful twang in her chest at the thought. I had no idea, she whispered, watching Hubert's eyebrows twitch as he struggled to keep his expression calm. However, I must ask. Do you truly believe that he can be redeemed? She did not want to remember her most recent interaction with Lysias, but she couldn't help but think back to the absolute contempt in his eyes as he looked at her, the cold indifference with which he had whipped his hand across her cheek, the unflinching ease with which he had referred to the people of Fodlan as beasts. Clearly, he was very far gone from the sweet child he had supposedly once been. Was it even possible to revert all of Thale's manipulation now? It is my duty to try, Hubert said quietly, sounding as though he didn't quite believe it would be possible either. Can I trust that you will do your utmost to keep him alive today? She looked away, not wishing to give him an answer before she had properly considered the significance behind his request. If she said yes, not only would she have to stop Lysias, she also had to do it in a way that assured his survival. She had already seen how that had ended for Hubert. Had he sincerely attempted to kill Lysias, he might have had a better chance at success. Instead, he had been overpowered and defeated with little exertion on Lysia's part. How were they supposed to incapacitate him without lethal force? And even if they did manage to do so, how could they ever convince him of what had been done to him, if as soon as he awakened, he could simply choose to refuse to listen and kill them all with a single hand wave? As though sensing her doubt, Hubert drew his attention by raising his hand, from which the now opened bracelets dangled harmlessly. Constance felt a shiver run through her body as she looked at them. She lifted her gaze to Hubert's eyes, and as soon as she saw his expression, she knew. You want to use the bracelets on him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hubert nodded solemnly. Yes. If we can restrain his magic, we may be able to subdue him without causing him irreparable harm. He tilted his head slightly to the side, studying her face. Do you oppose the idea? Constance sighed. Clearly her emotions were apparent in her expression. She knew the terrible feeling of helplessness the bracelets had caused her, and the thought of inflicting that upon someone else made her stomach churn. To bestow the same horrible punishment upon Lysias that had so tormented her felt cruel, but at the same time, fitting. And if it was the only way to have a chance to redeem Lord Lucas? No, she said after a moment of deliberation. I believe it will be a difficult task, but not impossible. Especially if we find a suitable distraction. She paused, wincing as she thought back to her most recent encounter with Lysias again. I suspect this will not be to your liking, but I may just have an idea for such a distraction. Chapter 24, The True Enemy, PT 3. The throne room of the Adrestian Palace was in chaos. The sound of clashing weapons and magic and the screams of combatants filled the air, creating a cacophony of violence that echoed between the walls. Spells zipped through the room, their brilliant colors and violent explosions clashing with the ornate, stately decor of the grand chamber, shattering marble columns and carving deep grooves into the floor. In the midst of it all, two people traded blows, their intense battle a whirlwind of power. Byleth, the fiancé of the Adrestian emperor, fighting with the most powerful crest weapon in existence, and a man with glowing hair and limbs, the name of whom Lysias had never bothered to ask for, shifting between offensive magic and a pair of swords, one of which looked almost ethereal. The man had a deathly focused look in his eyes as he relentlessly attacked Byleth, who expertly parried every blow even as his gaze darted around the room for any advantages he could make use of. Edelgard had initially taken cover behind the throne as spells wheezed past above her, but was now running out into the fray to fight by her beloved's side. Sylvain and Happy, who had likely been drawn to the commotion just as Lysias and Bias but arrived before them, were fully focused on trying to protect and aid their allies as they clearly struggled with their own confusion as to the situation before them. And Lysias, still disguised as Hubert, found himself in the precarious position of trying to decide how to act. He had no idea who the mysterious instigator was except that he had been the one to hand over Constance, but his single-minded focus on Byleth, as well as the destruction he was causing, made it clear that he was an enemy of the Adrestian Empire. Were Lysias to join him, they would likely be the victors in no time at all. However, dethroning or killing the Emperor wasn't currently in his interests. His mission had been to infiltrate the Empire, not destroy it. Furthermore, he held no knowledge as to the stranger's end goals, and whether they would align with his own. On the other hand, he knew beyond a shadow of doubt that Sylvain and Happy were aware of his disguise at this point. Happy had clearly been the one to send her monsters after him in the bar where he confronted Hubert, and she and Sylvain had been gone from the palace ever since that day. They must have returned today together with Hubert, meaning that they would likely take any chance they got to attack him. If they hadn't had their hands full with the bounty hunter, they doubtlessly would have already. Keeping up the pretense with them at this point would be naive at best. However, Lysia's eyes darted between the combatants. The stranger was barely breaking a sweat as he rained down magical and physical attacks on his foes, and while Byleth fought valiantly, and had several competent allies on his side, it was clear where this conflict would end if nothing extraordinary happened. This was no ordinary bounty hunter. This was an extremely powerful elder mage, one who couldn't possibly have evaded the attention of Thales and his top commanders. And yet, Bias seemed completely taken aback by the stranger's raw power as well, seemingly even more so than Lysias. Disguised once again as one of Hubert's spies, she stood off to the side, arms raised in front of her chest in the beginning of an attack, but frozen in place in a similar vein as Lysias as she stared at the scene in front of her. The chaos in the throne room raged on while she remained locked within her own mind. Lysias narrowed his eyes, taking in the unusual expression on her face. It was clear that something about the attacker had shaken her, but even so, he couldn't fathom why she would. A movement in the corner of his eye drew his attention. A magical projectile as dark as the void was heading straight for Edelgard. "Get down," he yelled, instinctively throwing out his arm to bring up a shield of black darkness in front of her as she tried to duck out of the way. The shield caught most of the spell's force, but a faint blur of power still passed through, knocking her off her feet. He darted forward even as his hands shaped into a spell to create a stronger shield in front of her. He reached her just as another projectile hit the shield, but this time it blocked the attack completely. Leaning in over her with one arm extended to the side to power the shield spell, he met her bemused gaze and realized with a start that his instincts had just chosen a side for him. Well, caution be damned, he could just as well lean into it now. After all, there couldn't possibly have been any time for Sylvain and Happy to explain the situation to Edelgard. To her, he'd still be her loyal vassal. "Lady Edelgard," he said urgently as he offered her his free hand. "You shouldn't be here. Your defenses." "I am not leaving Byleth," she said, ignoring his hand to instead push herself to her feet on her own. He winced as another spell hit the shield. It hadn't been a direct attack, just a stray bolt of darkness that would have nevertheless easily killed her. He inhaled and exhaled deeply, fighting against the instinct to simply grab her and tell her to leave or he would knock her out and throw her out of the room. "Lady Edelgard, if you perish here." "Cover me, then," she replied, already turning to leave the protection of the shield as she brandished her axe, "but do not dare to stop me." Clenching his jaw, he watched her run toward the epicenter of the battle. Fine. If this was how she wanted to play it. His gaze darted toward Byleth and the bounty hunter, his hands enveloping in darkness as he let his mind take in the current state of the battle. The man was still locked in combat with Byleth, dead set on eliminating him first, but their fight was explosive and volatile to everyone around them, especially to an emperor who mainly excelled in physical defense rather than magical. Well, I suppose that is why a mage was chosen as her vassal. And Lysias was the perfect man for the job. As stray spells flew dangerously close to Edelgard, he deflected them with calculated precision. Each time a spell approached, he quickly analyzed its trajectory and countered with a spell of his own, the opposing forces colliding and dissipating in midair with a burst of sparks and energy. As long as she had him to cover her back, she would be practically invincible. Meanwhile, Byleth, Sylvain, and Happy struggled to hold their ground against the relentless assault from the mysterious mage. Lysias could see that their combined effort was gradually wearing them down, their faces glistening with sweat and eyes clouded with exhaustion. The bounty hunter showed no such signs of weariness, moving with a fluidity and grace that belied his destructive power. As Edelgard closed in on the battle and Lysias deflected yet another spell headed in her direction, he quickly glanced over at Bias and saw that she was making her way toward the attacker, her eyes locked on him with unwavering determination. He couldn't fathom her plan, but with the situation growing more desperate, he couldn't afford to let his curiosity distract him. The Emperor had at least been clever enough not to directly engage with the Elder Mage. She stayed some distance away, ready to assist if necessary against the relentless assault of the mysterious attacker. Deciding to ignore Bias for now and focus on his own problems, Lysias continued to shield Edelgard from the relentless onslaught of spells. For now, his priority was to protect the stubborn Emperor. The continuous barrage, however, meant that he had no opportunity to turn his own offensive magic against the attacker, who still had the upper hand. Sylvain and Happy, while attempting to provide support, were being pushed back by the sheer force of the attacker's onslaught. They were nothing, not even ants, to this man. Byleth's deft movements and powerful sword allowed him to hold his own, but he was visibly worn out, while the mage was literally aglow with power. The latter launched a powerful attack, a combination of magic and a quick slash of his sword which sent Byleth stumbling back, out of breath. For a moment, the relentless attacks stopped, and an almost surrealistic silence lowered itself down over them. Then, the silence was broken by a huff of laughter from the mysterious mage. "Finally, your reign of tyranny shall be brought to an end," he said, flexing his sword arms as he slowly strode toward Byleth, who stood panting and bent over near the stairs leading up to the throne. "I shall finish what you began so long ago, put you down like the beast that you are." Lysias' mind ground to a halt. Beast? Was this elder mage one of Thales's allies? But if so, why had he come to put a stop to their plans? Was Thales so convinced of their imminent defeat? Epimenides. Lysias' head snapped in the direction of Bias as he took in the disbelief and reverence in her voice. She had stopped some distance away from the two combatants, warily eyeing the elder mage. Epimenides? What in the it couldn't possibly. The mage paused, the glow in his hair dimming ever so slightly as he turned to face Bias. For a moment, everything was silent yet again, as everyone around him warily waited, weapons ready, for his next move. Then, the ethereal sword in his left hand vanished. "Is that you, Bias?" he asked, his voice withdrawn yet somehow carrying a hidden depth of emotion. "I had assumed you were long dead." Bias hesitated for a moment, still somewhat cautious about the man in front of her. However, Lysias could see her relax slightly as she realized that he wouldn't immediately attack her. "I could say the same for you," she said. "You vanished during the very peak of the war, gone without a trace, leaving us to fend for ourselves without your technology. We were forced to retreat underground to lick our wounds." She paused. "We were convinced that you had perished." The mysterious mage seemed taken aback by this, momentarily stunned as he took in Bias' words. He raised his free hand to his temple, closing his eyes for a moment as if trying to recall some ancient memory. "I was sure all had been lost to the waters," he murmured, only just loud enough that Lysias could hear the words. "The flood. It was all-consuming. I did the only thing I could think of. The only method of preservation yet known to me." Lysias watched the exchange between the two ancient mages, a surrealistic feeling wrapping itself around him. He'd known that the attacker was no ordinary foe, but to learn that it was Epimenides. Lord Epimenides had been one of the Ancient Ones, one of the original people that had fought against the false goddess and her beasts, an Agarthan commander on par with Thales in both rank and skill. An esteemed mage and scientist who had unlocked the secret to eternal life, only to, as told by legend, be lost to the waves of the ancient war just before he could put his research into practice on a wider scale. While some of that research had been uncovered after his death, making it possible for a handful of chosen Agarthan leaders to transfer their consciousness down through the ages, the full depth of his knowledge had been lost along with him, leaving the remaining Agarthans in a despairing darkness. There could not have been a single person in Shamhala who hadn't known Lord Epimenides' name, but Lysias was more intimately familiar with the name than most of them. He had heard the name spoken with reverence for years, even before he was initialized into Thales' inner circle. His late mother, a proficient scientist specialized in the very arts developed by Lord Epimenides, had made certain that he knew the history of their revolutionary ancestor by heart. Lord Epimenides was a man who dared to believe in the value of life, while every single one of his peers had sought the honor of death. And here he stood in full glory by all intents and purposes, an Agarthan demigod in the throne room of the Adrestian palace, only briefly distracted from an assassination attempt on one of the most powerful warriors in all of Fodlan. Lysias had never even begun to imagine that he would need to prepare for a scenario like this. Said demigod lifted his head now, eyes fluttering open as his hand fell back to his side. Is Thales alive as well? Bias glanced in the direction of Byleth, who was watching the scene with guarded curiosity, his stance prepared. Yes, she said as she turned her attention back to the other mage. You returned to us in the midst of our most recent plot, at a rather inopportune moment. Lysias bit down a desperate laugh. Inopportune, yes. It was certainly inopportune. An ancient Agarthan commander was not only interrupting their operation, but actively working against it. Knowing his identity now, Lysias was quite frankly shocked that he had been able to withstand his attacks until now. Clearly Edelgard had only found herself in the crossfire. If Lord Epimenides had intended to strike her, things would have been much more dire. He glanced in her direction, only just catching her inconspicuously stepping in front of Byleth to conceal him from Epimenides' view as a mage came up to heal him. It happened in less than 10 seconds, over and done with so quickly that it nearly seemed rehearsed. A sneer crossed Epimenides' face as his gaze swept across the room. It landed on Lysias, pausing there for a few seconds as the ancient commander studied him with narrowing eyes. Lysias froze in place, barely breathing as he tried to recall every little detail he knew about Lord Epimenides, his powers, and his past. Could he see through the disguise? Or did he sense something else from him? The ancient mage extended a hand in Lysias' direction, and then he felt a sucking sensation in his body. His disguise vanished in a flurry of elder magic sparks, and he found himself standing in the throne room of the Adrestian palace in his very own body, no longer disguised as Hubert. He clenched his jaw, glancing at Edelgard just in time to see her narrow her eyes at him. But there was no shock in her expression, only cool judgment. Realization, cold and jarring, slammed into him. She already knew. Yes, Lord Epimenides said as his gaze returned to Bias, voice dripping with sarcasm. I can see that. A plot that seemingly excluded a vital detail. Bias, who had also had her disguise evaporated, opened her mouth to answer, eyes wide and confused, but no sound seemed to come out. Epimenides sighed. You always were a fool, Bias. While you wasted your time with your precious schemes and plots, the true enemy has been right in front of you all along. He gestured at Byleth with an almost dismissive flick of his hand. This man, or rather, the creature contained within, is a greater threat to our cause than any other. All eyes immediately turned to Byleth, including Edelgard's. However, while even the Emperor's expression was one of cold confusion, the man himself simply clenched his jaw and met Epimenides' gaze without so much as a hint of shock. Everyone knew that the former mercenary, the Ashen Demon, was a skilled warrior, skilled enough to survive encounters with powerful Agarthan mages. However, to imply that he was the greatest threat to the Agarthan civilization. Only by destroying the abomination inside the Ashen Demon, Epimenides continued, can we bring salvation to the world. He flicked out his left arm, and a second sword materialized in his hand once again. Then he launched himself at Byleth with renewed fervor, the glow of his hair and limbs becoming more intense as he closed in on his target. But Byleth was ready, and he managed to parry the first strike, sparks flying as his legendary weapon met the ethereal sword. With a battle cry, Edelgard rushed to her fiancé's side, brandishing her own weapon. Gritting his teeth, he watched as the Emperor of Adrestia and the Ashen Demon fought Lord Epimenides. The two of them moved in perfect harmony, their attacks synchronized as they struck at the ancient mage from every angle. While Byleth struck fast and true from the front, parrying Epimenides' attacks with graceful ease, Edelgard assisted by lunging at Epimenides from the side, hoping to catch him off guard. The ancient mage, however, was no stranger to battle, and quickly sidestepped her every attack, his ethereal sword barely ever leaving Byleth's. Lysias knew without a shadow of a doubt that Edelgard would fight to her last breath to protect Byleth, even if it meant facing an Agarthan legend, and her weakness to magic meant that without Lysias' protection, she would likely fall in battle before long. Once again, he was faced with an impossible decision. To say that he felt torn would be to greatly understate the situation. This was the man who had shaped the very foundations of Agarthan society, who had been believed dead for centuries. And now, he had returned at a critical moment in their plan, with an agenda that seemed to contradict everything they had been working for. Lysias knew that his Embias operation was over, and he had little hope of escaping once the battle was concluded. If he wished to escape, he would need to do it now, while Edelgard, Byleth and the others had their hands full with Epimenides. However, if he left now, there was a very real chance that Edelgard might die. He glanced over at Bias, hoping for some sort of plan or signal, but she was still rooted to the spot, her expression one of anguish and disbelief. In that moment, Lysias knew that he couldn't rely on Bias for help. He would have to take matters into his own hands. Realizing that he couldn't afford to wait any longer, he made a snap decision. Even knowing that it might spell his own doom, he called on his magic and warped himself to Edelgard's side just as Epimenides unleashed a powerful magical attack in her direction. The energy crackled through the air, and he could feel the sheer power of it even as he braced himself to intercept it, throwing up as much of a shield as he could in so little time. The force of the blow was so great that Lysias staggered, feeling the weight of the ancient magic nearly crushing him, grinding against his bones as though gravity had just tripled in strength. But he refused to give in, stubbornly holding on even as the energy threatened to overwhelm him. He gritted his teeth, eyes narrowing as he focused all of his energy on maintaining the shield around Edelgard, encouraged by the knowledge that it would have been impossible for her to withstand such an attack without his intervention. As the pressure against him began to stabilize, allowing him to shift his weight and get a better feel for the spell, Lysias' gaze flicked toward Edelgard. There was a mix of surprise and something akin to gratitude in her eyes, and for a moment, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction at her acknowledgement. But he quickly pushed that feeling aside, focusing all his attention on the task at hand. With one final surge of strength, he pushed against Epimenides' power and finally managed to deflect the brunt of the force, the energy dissipating into the air around them. He stumbled slightly from the exertion as he let the barrier drop, his body aching and weary from the strain of the encounter. Epimenides looked at him with a mixture of surprise and rage. "You stand against your own people?" he asked, his voice as cold and menacing as the darkest depths of Shambhala. Lysias met his gaze unflinchingly. "If you kill this woman," he replied, "Fodlan falls into chaos. That would not benefit our people." For a moment, the ancient mage studied him in silence, seeming to take in his words with some manner of deliberation. A rare sentiment to be uttered by one of Thal's lackeys. Sparks of magic began to climb up his arms again. "It is not my intention to harm her. However, anyone who stands between me and the Ashen Demon shall be deemed to have forfeited their life. And Edelgard will never abandon her fiancé." Lysias pulled up a new barrier around Edelgard, who had moved up beside him now. She looked at him with a wary expression. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice firm but filled with suspicion. Lysias didn't answer immediately, mainly because he wasn't certain why he felt so strongly that she must survive. He was a soldier, an Agarthan, and he had always put the needs of his people above all else. And yet, here he was, fighting against one of the most powerful mages in history, all to protect a woman who was, in many ways, his enemy. The reasonable thing, the correct thing to do, would have been to turn on his heel and flee as soon as he learned of Epimenides' identity. But he couldn't, for some inexplicable reason, allow Edelgard to die. While he did believe that her death would throw Fodlan into chaos, it hadn't merely been a lie to sway Lord Epimenides. That was not the entire reason behind his actions. It wasn't merely about preserving the balance in Fodlan. Something about Edelgard compelled him to protect her, a connection he couldn't quite understand or explain. Still, there was no need for the Emperor herself to know that part. He turned his gaze forward, meeting Epimenides' cold gaze as the ancient mage prepared another attack. "Because," he said, addressing Edelgard even as he held his gaze on Epimenides, "you do a terrible job of keeping yourself alive." He glanced at her with a sneer. "No wonder Hubert always insists on staying near you. You're like a child who cannot keep herself from running into trouble as soon as her parents turn their backs." "Bold words from the likes of you," she said in a level voice. "At least I fight for what I believe in, rather than simply following orders like a mindless puppet." Lysias scoffed, unable to stop an ironic smile from appearing on his lips. He couldn't deny that there was a shred of truth in what she said, but the fact that she was choosing this moment to say it a moment when he had, for once, acted on his own was amusing. Enough of this, Epimenides announced, his voice echoing throughout the throne room as he once again charged at Byleth. The Ashen Demon managed to block the strike, but the force of the blow sent him skidding backward, his boots scraping against the marble floor. Edelgard glanced over at Lysias, her weapon at the ready. "I do not trust you," she said, "but if you truly wish to protect me, then you will help us defeat him." The conviction in her words left him with no doubt that she was serious. And as she moved away to aid Byleth, he realized that he had no choice but to side with her and the Empire at this point. However, while he generally possessed a great confidence in his abilities, he was acutely aware that his magical energy was far from limitless, and he had already expended a great deal of it just to deflect Epimenides' previous attack. He wouldn't be able to shield Edelgard like this indefinitely. He glanced at Bias, who seemed to have shaken off her shock but was still standing to the side, reluctant to participate in the conflict with her old comrade. "Bias!" he called out, watching her eyes instantly snap to him. "You need to keep Edelgard out of harm's way. Set your own emotions aside and see to it that this operation does not fail any worse than it already has." Bias' gaze flicked between him and Epimenides. In rank, Bias far surpassed Lysias, and when they had first been assigned this operation together, she had wasted no time in reminding him of that fact. After all, she was an ancient mage from the era of the Great War, while he was, as she often liked to call him, a mere whelp in comparison. But now, in this moment, her eyes seemed to reflect an understanding of the gravity of the situation. In this moment, there could exist no rank, all that mattered was that they worked together to minimize the damage. And Bias knew this as well as he did. She hesitated for only a moment longer before nodding firmly. Then she stepped forward, her own hands alight with the power of her magic as she created a new, strong shield around the Emperor. Exhaling in relief, Lysias took a step back and allowed himself to relax some of the tension in his body. With Bias protecting Edelgard, he could focus on coming up with a plan for how to deal with Lord Epimenides. But he had barely taken a single deep breath when a tingle almost like a premonition ran up his spine. "She is here." A piercing cold shot through the air just as he instinctively dodged to the side. An enormous shard of ice had come flying at him from an unexpected direction, narrowly missing his head. As he looked toward the source of the attack, his eyes met with the determined and proud gaze of Constance von Novelli, who was just striding into the room. He stared at the sparks forming around her hands, distantly preparing a counterspell of his own for her next attack. How in the everlasting underworld had she escaped from her bindings? He'd locked her in that room, without any access to magic, and unless those bracelets functioned differently than he'd assumed. Constance unleashed another volley of ice shards at him, forcing him to react. He gritted his teeth and raised his hands, summoning a barrier of darkness to shield himself from the projectiles. The shards of ice shattered against his magical defenses, but after the collision with Epimenides' magic, his magic was unusually sluggish and unresponsive. He could feel her attacks drain him even further. As he let the barrier fall, anger flared within him at the audacity of this aggravating woman who constantly insisted on being a thorn in his side. Surely Constance must have seen some of his efforts to protect Edelgard? Did she even stop to think that without him, her precious emperor might very well have been dead at this point? Constance remained at a distance, her gaze locked on him as she sent a barrage of spells his way. It was clear that she wanted to engage him in combat, to pull him away from the main conflict. A naive tactic that wouldn't work. Especially considering how weak and imprecise her attacks had been so far. It was clear that she was out of practice. "You're rusty," he called as he danced out of the way of a small but sharp burst of shards. "This is child's play. What are you hoping to achieve?" Constance's eyes narrowed as her next spell took shape in her hands. "I will not allow you to harm Lady Edelgard, Happy or anyone else fighting on the side of the Empire." He would have laughed if he hadn't been so exhausted. "Look around, love," he called back as he just barely dodged a flash of lightning extending from her fingertips. "Who do you think is your main threat at the moment?" She didn't answer, focusing instead on her next assault. But as he continued to parry her attacks, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. There was something off about the way she fought, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. She seemed to be holding back, but why? His eyes flicked to her wrists for a split second, and in that moment, he understood. "Ah," he said, smiling bitterly. "Now I see." Tiring of her games, he called upon his magic and warped to her location in an instant. Constance's eyes widened in shock as he appeared beside her, but she quickly recovered and tried to dodge away. He grabbed her arm, his fingers wrapping tightly around her wrist, then drained her of her magic as he pulled her close and hissed into her ear. "Hubert is nearby, isn't he? You're just a distraction, meant to keep me occupied while he strikes from the shadows. Well, it won't work. Your plan has failed." He extended his free arm up above them, expending part of the energy he'd stolen from Constance in order to create a dark barrier around them, one that would protect them from any stray spells and alert him if anyone tried to enter the space around them. Constance stared at him, wide-eyed and unable to hide the shock and fear in her gaze, a sight that was like music to his ears. But she quickly masked her expression, her lips curling into a small, defiant smile. "No," she said. "Your plan has failed. Your ruse has been revealed, and we shall defeat you once and for all." Lysias sneered at her, but inwardly, he knew that there was some truth in her words. He was exhausted, his own magic severely depleted, and he had lost his brief window of time to escape. If Hubert truly was nearby, biding his time and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, then he was in a precarious position. However, he was nothing if not tenacious, and he knew that Constance was merely trying to put him off balance. "You continue to underestimate me," he said, tightening his grip on her arm. He could feel the energy he had drained from her coursing through him, a small but welcome boost to his reserves. "I have survived worse than this." A strange flicker of emotion passed behind her eyes, almost like pity. It infuriated him. How dare she look at him like that, as if he were some pathetic creature to be pitied? The rage bubbled up within him, dark and seething, pushing at the boundaries of his self-control. He could feel the pressure building inside him, demanding release, and for a moment, he was tempted to give in to it. Thales and his plans be damned, this woman needed to pay for her deeds. But he knew that losing control now would only serve to put him at a disadvantage. His grip on Constance's arm tightened further, and he reveled in the pained gasp that escaped her lips. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You forget the hold that I have on you. And even if you capture me, even if you beat me within an inch of my life, I will never free you of that curse. You will be forever plagued by the fear that at any moment, you may turn and betray those you care about the most in life." Constance's face paled, and her defiance faltered for a moment. But then her eyes met his, their blue depths full of determination. "You shall not break me," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "And my fear shall never hold me prisoner again, even if the curse never falters." Lysias stared at her, the fire of his anger burning hotter and brighter. How could she still look at him with such determination after what he had done to her? And how could she be so utterly defiant, so confident and spiteful, after what she had done to him? The rage clawed at him, demanding release, and he knew he was on the verge of doing something he would not be able to take back. "You are nothing," he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper as he leaned in closer to her. "You are weak, and you're powerless, and your rightful place is on your knees, begging me for mercy." He had hoped to shut her up once and for all, but he should have known that Constance would never back down. She raised her chin, holding his gaze in a vice grip, and he could tell that whatever she was about to say, he wouldn't much appreciate it. "Weak, you say?" she asked, and although she did her best to sound cold, he could hear an uncertainty trembling beneath the surface. Could a weakling bring all of Shamhala to ruin? The fury that had been simmering within him finally reached its boiling point. With a snarl, he reached out and grabbed her throat, his fingers digging into her soft flesh. Constance's face grew pale, and she clawed at his hand, trying to break his grip. But even as he held her life in his hands, she didn't back down, her gaze locked onto his with a fierce defiance that only stoked his rage. The fact that she could stand there, completely untouched by emotions, and take pride in what she had done to Shamhala. "You really enjoy toying with death, don't you?" he snapped. "Do you even care for your own life?" "You have been fooled," she gasped, her voice weak but unyielding. You are not who you believe yourself to be. Thales has tricked you, and you are allowing his darkness to spread. Lysia's mouth twitched, his hand just slightly relaxing its grip around her throat to allow air to rush into her lungs again. She gasped for breath, face becoming slightly less pale. This was a last desperate attempt at saving her own hide, it had to be. She couldn't possibly know that he had suspected for a while now that Thales, as well as Bias, were keeping vital information from him. Yet her words struck a nerve in him, and the wish to demand clarification was so overwhelming that he could barely keep himself from asking the question that had been plaguing him for so long now. What are they keeping from me? But she couldn't know. She couldn't possibly know. This was just a desperate attempt to unbalance him. He squeezed her throat tighter, his fingers digging deeper into her flesh as if he could squeeze the defiance out of her. He could see the panic beginning to set in as Constance's face turned into a sickly shade of blue, her eyes beginning to water from the strain. The shock and fear in her eyes were gratifying, but they did little to quell the storm inside him. What would you know? He spat as he tightened his grip on her throat once more. You are a desperate, pathetic creature who will say anything to save herself. You are no better than the rest of these miserable Fodlan beasts. I have seen the depths of your soul, Constance von Novelli, and it is blacker than any abyss. He could feel her pulse fluttering beneath his fingers, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw in air. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she refused to look away, her gaze fixed on his as if she were challenging him to do his worst. It took every ounce of his willpower to resist the urge to crush her windpipe. Perhaps, she gasped, but surely it is not blacker than the graves of your people. She did not deserve death. You, he growled, his voice barely more than a whisper, have sealed your fate. The air crackled with the raw power of magic, as spells of varying types flew through the air, seeking their targets. The scene was bathed in a cacophony of light and darkness, the shadows dancing wildly on the walls. But as Lysia's thumb pressed down against her windpipe, the colors and sounds of the room around them began to die out, along with her consciousness. Is he truly going to kill me? His eyes, swimming in blackness, were darker and angrier than she had ever seen them before as they focused fully on hers. But there was also a strange twitch to his face muscles, as though he was fighting a battle against himself. She could only hope that whichever part of him hesitated to kill her would win. As though granting her wish, his grip loosened slightly, and she panted for breath again, head swimming as she tried to regain herself from the loss of oxygen. But it didn't take long before she could feel the familiar sensation of being hexed into submission. She tried to turn her head, but his fingers quickly climbed up just enough along her throat that he could hold her in place, forcing her to face forward. With his other hand still firmly locked around her wrist, continuously draining her of her power, there was nothing she could do to stop him, except close her eyes. Lysia scoffed. You think that will stop me? He asked in a mocking tone. Let me tell you a little something about curses, love. He leaned in to whisper in her ear, voice becoming silky smooth. A curse creates an intimate bond between the caster and the target, he said, causing her to shiver at the new proximity. I assume you've had dreams, perhaps even visions, about me? Well, so have I, about you. Our connection exists on a psychological level, in the subconscious parts of your mind. And as a handy little consequence, as long as we are close enough, I have easy access to those very parts. As he said the last few words, the relieving darkness of her eyelids began to slip away, and shapes appeared before her. Her heart dropped as the image began to form into a coherent whole. She recognized the setting almost immediately, the lush, verdant gardens of her family's estate in Novelli. The pristine pathways were lined with beautiful flowers, their vibrant colors standing out against the greenery. It was a place she had once found comfort in, a place that represented the love and warmth of her family. No, she whispered, suspecting and fearing where he was heading with this show of power. I've read up on you, Lysias said, his voice like poison seeping into her mind. Bias as well. We wanted to know what would make you tick, where your unusual shift in personalities originated from. We always do our research before an operation. The image before her was so vivid, even complete with sounds of birdsong, music, a gurgling brook, scents of blossoming roses, a faint scent of supper being prepared in the kitchen, even the sensation of the sun's warmth on her skin. It was similar to how Hubert had recreated these very gardens for her during his proposal, but even more intense. A lovely place, the harbour town of Novelli, Lysias continued in a menacing whisper. Such a shame it had to end the way it did. She could feel the atmosphere begin to change again. First, it was the birdsong that vanished, then the warmth on her skin evaporated. Constance desperately tried to hold on to the first image. Perhaps then she could keep herself at bay, but the memory was already tainted, and she was unable to stop the change. The air began to fill with the acrid stench of smoke, the once clear sky darkening with ominous clouds. Flames danced along the edges of the garden, slowly creeping closer and closer, consuming everything in their path. Constance's breath caught in her throat, her eyes flicking open in a desperate attempt to escape the image, but it was plastered onto reality before her as well, taking the place of the throne room around them. And she couldn't look away. Lysias had her in his grasp, his hand around her throat serving as a cruel reminder of his power over her. He pulled back just enough that his face came into view, and the venomous smile on his lips as he forced her to relive the worst day of her life was a testament to just how much she had managed to rile him up. As the fires raged around her, Constance felt her anxiety rise, her chest tightening with each ragged breath she took. She knew that it was all an illusion, a twisted manifestation of Lysias' magic, but the pain and fear felt all too real. The memory played out before her, as vivid and terrifying as if it were happening all over again. She saw her family members, the people she had loved and cherished, falling one by one to the merciless blades and arrows of their enemies. The beautiful gardens in her home were reduced to rubble and ash, the once peaceful haven turned into a hellscape of fire and destruction. Tears streamed down her cheeks, the images of her family's demise replayed over and over again like a cruel loop. Constance could feel herself slipping, the pain and horror threatening to engulf her entirely and bring forth the curse yet again, which was doubtlessly Lysias' intention. But deep within her, something stirred. A small voice, fearful and powerless, asking for her help in a plea that was already beyond desperate. Please, please take it away. Please make it stop. Please protect me. It was a voice she had heard many times in the past years, but which she had so often ignored, her more fragile and vulnerable self that had plagued her for so long. The part of her that had carried the shame and guilt for years, blaming herself for not warning her family of their impending doom. She knew now that she had been wrong to push that part of her down, to punish and scold her. It was not what she needed, it was, in fact, the very opposite. She needed her help and comfort, just like any small child who believed with full certainty that they had caused their loved ones such pain. And that was why she couldn't give in to Lysias' sadistic game. She had to be strong not just for herself, but for that fragile part of her that needed her love and support. It had not been her fault, and she needed to be kind to the part of herself that had carried that burden of guilt for so long. Constance closed her eyes to shut out Lysias, and focused on her inner self with all the tenderness and care she could muster. She imagined herself reaching out to the scared, broken girl she had once been, enfolding her in a comforting embrace, reassuring her that she was not alone. It was not your fault, she whispered softly to herself. You could not have known what would happen. No one blames you, you have to forgive yourself. Lysias' grip tightened around her throat. Not your fault. He snarled. If it weren't for you, your family might still be alive. The entire town of Novelli might not have been consumed by flames. You left them to the wolves, and now you dare to exonerate yourself from all guilt and blame. Constance refused to let his words penetrate the mental shield she was trying to build around herself. She focused on the image of herself comforting her younger self, their embrace warm and soothing. No, she insisted firmly, her voice barely audible but unwavering. I was just a child. I cannot change the past, and it was not my responsibility to protect everyone. I will not let my grief and guilt consume me any longer. I will protect the part of me that still hurts and help her heal. Breathing deeply, she opened her eyes. The illusion of Novelli burning before her eyes still held up behind Lysias, but it was no longer as all-consuming as before. Her breathing steadied, and she could feel her resolve hardening. Lysias' expression darkened, the anger and hatred in his eyes almost palpable. You do not deserve to heal, he growled, his voice dripping with anger. Not after what you did. The illusion of the Novelli gardens dissolved before her, only to be replaced by another memory. They were standing in the woods in near complete darkness, and for a brief moment, Constance only felt confusion as to what he intended to show her. But then, the sky lit up. The night sky above Shamhala was ablaze with the light of the ancient Agarthan javelins, streaking down toward the city like deadly shooting stars. She could feel the raw power coursing through her veins as she had called forth the devastating attack, a last resort to save her friends and stop Thales from attempting to use them on the Empire in the future. She gasped out as javelin after javelin struck the hidden city, feeling her heart race faster and faster in time with the collisions. Lysias leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. "You may have been a child during the fall of Novelli, but this was your doing. This was a conscious act, committed with clarity. You willingly brought death and suffering to all those people." The scene shifted, and Constance was forced to witness the horrifying aftermath of her actions. The once pristine underground city was reduced to rubble, the streets littered with the lifeless bodies of thousands of innocent civilians, some wedged beneath heavy blocks of stone. Men, women, and children, none had been spared the deadly consequences of her actions. "Look at what you've done," Lysias said, and it was apparent in his trembling voice that the images around them filled him with grief as well. "Look at all the lives you've destroyed. How can you possibly claim to be innocent when you've caused so much pain and suffering? You are a monster." The illusion of Shamhala continued to play out around them, the screams of agony and the cries for help echoing in her ears. Constance's heart was racing so fast that it threatened to burst out of her chest, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps as the overwhelming guilt threatened to crush her. The tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she struggled to maintain her mental barrier. "No," she sobbed. I am not a monster. I made a difficult, rash decision that took many innocent lives away, but I am not defined by it. I will do everything in my power to atone for my actions and make sure that no one else suffers the way they did." "You think pretty words will save you?" Lysias spat. "You cannot undo what you have done. You cannot bring back the dead or heal the wounds you have inflicted. You deserve to burn in a hell of your own making." The visions intensified, the screams of Agarthan children and other innocents growing in strength until they were nearly unbearably loud. She wanted to cover her ears, but even if she could, she knew that it would not help. It was all in her head. Constance's vision blurred with tears, her chest heaving as she desperately clung to the last shreds of her mental shield. Her body shook with sobs, each one punctuated by a sharp intake of breath. She couldn't deny the truth in Lysia's words. She had caused immense pain and suffering, and there was no way to take it back. The curse, which she had managed to stave off until now, was closing in rapidly, tearing and ripping at her as she tried to once again focus on her inner self. She gritted her teeth against the anguish, shaking her head in an attempt to free herself of the darkness, but she knew with a horrifying certainty that the point of no return had already been passed. She could not hope to shift this in her favor now. But then, just as Constance felt as though she was about to be consumed by grief and self-hatred, the visions abruptly stopped. The world around her snapped back to the throne room, the illusion of Shamhala vanishing as if it had never been there at all, and the grip around her neck disappeared in an instant. Constance gasped for air, her chest heaving as she fought to regain her composure. The relief that washed over her was almost enough to make her collapse, but she forced herself to remain upright. Lysias had stumbled backward, face bewildered and filled with panic. In an erratic movement, he brought a hand to one of his wrists and immediately froze in place. Constance lowered her gaze. There, clasped around his arms just above the seam of his gloves, were the bracelets. His dark gaze snapped back to Constance, and she could see the fear clearly in his eyes as he realized that his powers had been neutralized. He began to snarl, but his words abruptly cut off as a figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Seeing that his magic was no longer at his disposal, Lysias drew a dagger from his belt and tried to defend himself, but his disorientation from the sudden loss of his magic left him stumbling to the side. Hubert quickly overpowered him, knocking the dagger out of his hand and tripping his legs to make him fall to the floor. Before he could scramble up on his feet again, Hubert followed up with an elder spell that locked him in place, causing his limbs to freeze up and his head to loll back against the floor. While he might have been able to break out of the spell if he still had his magic, in this state, he was completely powerless. Constance stared at him for a moment after he had stilled, her body trembling from the ordeal she had just endured. Just like that, in a brief anticlimactic moment, the most destructive power Thales had been able to muster was incapacitated, the man who had plagued her for so long, disarmed and rendered harmless. Her breathing gradually steadied as she looked up at Hubert, his face filled with determination and concern as he too regarded Lysias on the floor. "Hubert," she whispered, her voice raw and shaky. He turned his head, eyes softening as he took in her tear-streaked face and the pain that was doubtlessly still etched into her features. He walked up to her and crouched beside her on the floor. Gently, he reached out to brush away a stray tear with his thumb. "You did well," he said softly. "He will not harm you again." She leaned her head against his hand, allowing herself to exhale and relax her tensed-up muscles. She had been so close. So close to succumbing to Lysia's mental onslaught. If Hubert hadn't been able to take him by surprise, or if he had waited just a moment longer, would she have once again turned against her allies? Would she have harmed Hubert yet again? He showed me Shamhala," she whispered, watching Hubert's eyes fill with comprehension. He stroked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Then you were incredibly brave and strong to withstand his influence," he said. She nodded, swallowing. She wanted to lean into him, to have him embrace her and make the last remnants of her fear and pain and horror disappear. But while the immediate danger in their corner of the throne room had been mitigated, the battle between Shay and Byleth still carried on not far from them, and as she turned her head to take in the current state of the fight, she realized with a skipped heartbeat that Byleth and Edelgard had been pushed into a corner. "The battle," she breathed, causing him to follow her gaze. "Yes," he said, pushing himself to his feet before he offered her a hand. She took it, wobbling as she stood up, but he steadied her by the elbows. "Bias seems to have called him Lord Epimenides. I'm afraid the name does not ring a bell, but it seems to carry great weight for the Agarthans." He paused, studying her face. "Do you know something?" Constance nodded, chest clenching as she took in Shay's glowing form. While there were many things she had yet to comprehend about all of this, she was certain beyond a shadow of doubt that the mage currently bearing down on her allies with sword and magic both was not truly Shay the oblivious bounty hunter anymore. His affliction might not be a curse, but it seemed to be just as all-consuming. "I do," she said. "And unfortunately, I believe we are now facing a threat much, much greater than Lysias." Chapter 25, The True Enemy, PT 4. The first time that Constance had seen Shay fight, she had feared for her life. He had sliced through 5 bandits, 5 mages, as though they had been nothing but butter. With glowing eyes and an additional sword conjured out of thin air, he had warped from bandit to bandit and struck them down in a matter of seconds. And as he'd returned to her and Linhard's side, with blood spattered onto his clothes and nary a scratch on himself, he had grinned. Her initial fear, which had been grounded in uncertainty as to his powers and his intentions, had eventually faded. However, even after getting to know him better in the weeks after and coming to rely on him as her bodyguard in Morpheus, even after realizing how distractible and, at times, slow he could be, there had always been a part of her that had continued to fear him. As she stood in a corner of the Adrestian throne room now, watching him rain down attack after attack onto Byleth and anyone who stood in his way, that fear bloomed once again. But this time, it was not a fear of the unknown. This danger was true and apparent, and it was clear to her that the friend she had found in Shay was no longer in control. This was not Shay at all. This was an ancient and powerful Agarthan by the name of Epimenides, and he would clearly not stop until either he or Byleth was dead. She looked at Hubert, who stood by her side, his face a mask of grim determination as he assessed the situation. He had placed himself between her and the ongoing battle, one hand raised in front of his chest, ready to counter any spell that may come flying in their direction. Truthfully, she still felt shaken from her encounter with Lysias, but there was no rest to be had until Epimenides was defeated, and although she supposed Hubert would prefer to see her stay out of harm's way, he must know that he needed her if they were to have a chance at victory. Not that she had any idea at the moment of how they would go about it. She had seen Lysias defend against Epimenides' attacks, and if even he struggled to hold his own against him, how were she and Hubert, who, unlike Lysias, were not built from the bones and blood of Nemesis, to defeat this ancient Agarthan commander? "Hubert," she said, causing him to glance down at her before returning his attention to the battle in the middle of the throne room. "How should we approach this?" She watched him take in the battle, spells of light and dark reflecting in his eyes as they darted between their allies and the Agarthan, clearly calculating various scenarios in his mind. Ordinarily, she would have simply thrown herself into the fight and improvised along the way, confident in her own abilities. But now, still out of practice and facing her mightiest opponent yet, she desperately hoped that her tactical expert of a fiancé would have a plan. Hubert's gaze remained fixed on the battle for a moment longer before he spoke, his voice low and measured. Byleth can hold his own against Epimenides, but if he were capable of defeating him, he would have done so by now. This will take all of our power, and even then, it will be grueling. His eyes flicked behind her. Constance turned her head and followed his gaze over to Lysias, whom they had moved to the innermost part of the corner they were in, partly concealed by a column. He was conscious but incapacitated. Hubert's elder magic glimmered around his limbs, including by the bracelets locked around his wrists. His gaze had seemingly been focused on the battle as well, but now he glanced up to meet her eyes. She resisted a shiver. Where before there had been hatred pooling in the blackness of those eyes, now there was only a resolute despondency, a reflection of the irrevocable defeat he had suffered. If they could trust him, he might be useful against Epimenides. However, if ever he were to become an ally, a man loyal to his true blood, it lay too far in the future to be able to depend upon him now. She swallowed as she recalled the white-hot rage in his eyes as his hand had squeezed around her throat. You deserve to burn in a hell of your own making. Facing forward again, she resisted an urge to cross her arms over her chest. She did not wish Lysias to know how he had affected her. There is still much I do not know about the Agarthan technology, Hubert continued as he returned his gaze to the battle as well, and although I would normally assume that a transferred consciousness completely overtakes the host, this particular case seems to build upon their most ancient technology, and the shift in personality has happened gradually. To my point, you have traveled with this mercenary and spent several hours with him as Epimenides. In your opinion, might there still be something left of this Shay beyond Epimenides' consciousness? Have you seen any signs that could indicate such? Following Epimenides' movements with her gaze, Constance thought back to her last hours in his company. Ever since that sudden shift in the harbor, when he had gone from gently trying to convince her that he would not harm her to coldly wrapping her in rope and throwing her over his shoulder, he had been an entirely different person than the Shay she had come to know. However, there had been this one moment, right before he left her alone with Lysias, where she had thought. Yes, Lysias had asked him to leave, and Shay, or rather, Epimenides, had hesitated. His gaze had flicked between Lysias and Constance, warily, as though he regretted the fact that she would very likely die if he left her alone with him. In the end, he had simply shaken his head and left. However, there had clearly been a moment of hesitation. Whether that hesitation had stemmed from Epimenides or Shay, she could not know, but at the very least it was something. I am uncertain, she replied. If he is still present somewhere, he is not strong enough to fight back against Epimenides' influence. There have been certain moments where doubt has flickered in his gaze, such as when he left me with Lysias, but that proves nothing. Hubert hummed thoughtfully. If nothing else, it hints at humanity. If you can find a way to reach Shay, you may be able to gain a valuable advantage. Find a way to reach Shay. How would she do that? Wait. She stared up at Hubert as her mind caught on to his phrasing. I may be able to? Whatever do you mean? Unfortunately, I cannot stay, he said, lowering his voice. Keeping Lysias here posits too much of a risk. We cannot focus on fighting Epimenides if we also need to worry that Bias might attempt to free him. I must bring him to the dungeons as soon as possible and ascertain that we have enough safeguards in place to keep any unauthorized people out. He could not be serious. Hubert, we need you. I am weakened and would be of little help, he said matter-of-factly, turning his head to meet her gaze. The bracelets work as a conduit for my magic. They allow the Elder Sharing spell to continue indefinitely, which means that part of my power is contained within the metal for as long as the spell lasts. Again, he glanced in Lysia's direction. It appears that the stronger the mage, the more of my powers are necessary to contain theirs. Constance found herself speechless as she took this information in. Temporarily pushing aside the insult of Hubert proposing that her powers were not strong enough to impact him nearly as much as Lysia's, she had to acknowledge that if Lysias was currently draining a large part of Hubert's powers through the bracelets, he might simply be a liability that the rest of them would need to protect. This was not good news. In fact, it was terrible news. She had counted on having him by her side. His hand fell onto her shoulder, his gaze intensely focused on her. "You withstood Lysias' willpower," he said. "I have full and complete faith in you. Aid our allies with your strength, and I will return before you know it." She swallowed. Knowing that there was nothing else she could do, she gave him a firm nod. Before withdrawing his hand, he leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. Constance held her breath, momentarily stunned by the unexpected show of affection. He smiled as he pulled back, looking as though he wished to say something else, but then his expression grew serious again, and he took a step back. As he swiped a gloved hand to the side, sparks of elder magic came into existence around him and Lysias both. Barely a second later, they disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only a faint glimmer where they had just been. Fully aware that time was wasting and that she couldn't afford to linger on Hubert's affectionate gesture, Constance returned her attention to the battlefield in order to think of a plan. Even if Shay was still in there and able to struggle against Epimenides, the latter seemed to be in perfect control for now. Counting on Shay was not a viable strategy. Rather, they needed to focus on the urgent objective of making certain that none of their allies lost their lives in the fight. With some measure of surprise, she realized as she watched the battle that Bias was still protecting Lady Edelgard from Epimenides' attacks, expertly shielding the Emperor even as she avoided any direct conflict with the ancient mage who should logically be her ally. She had heard Lysias give the command, but she was still very confused as to why they would deem it so important to keep the Adrestian Emperor alive. Was Lady Edelgard truly so vital to their plans? Apart from Lady Edelgard and Byleth, who were struggling but still holding their own, Constance could also see Sylvain and Happy in the fray, aiding the former two with defense and offense both. As far as she could tell, Happy had yet to sigh, since there were no monsters in sight. However, if the battle escalated beyond their capacity, that would most certainly be a useful method to pressure Epimenides, especially seeing how skilled Happy had become at controlling the monsters she summoned. For now, though, it would be preferable if they could somehow outmaneuver Epimenides without risking the destruction of the palace itself. As Constance saw it, they had three main objectives. First, they needed to protect themselves from harm, their main priority, seeing what a powerful foe they were facing. Second, they needed to at least attempt to reach Shay, to see if there was any part of him left that they could appeal to. And finally, they needed to weaken Epimenides enough to give Shay a fighting chance, if he was in fact still in there. The two latter objectives seemed very nearly impossible to achieve at the moment, so Constance focused on trying to come up with a plan for the first one. Now how would she appeal to Shay? Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted as a blast of elder magic just barely missed her, hitting the wall behind her instead. She instinctively ducked, realizing at once that standing still and thinking of a plan was a luxury she could not afford in this situation. Epimenides was relentless, his attacks calculated and vicious. He moved with an unnatural speed and precision, and his eyes were focused, cold and merciless. No, she could not wait any longer. She needed to act, to fight alongside her allies and do what she did best, improvise. Taking a deep breath and raising her chin in order to conjure some confidence, Constance called upon her magic. Lysias had been correct. Although she had somewhat managed to withstand him, she was very much out of practice, and the usual precision with which she had used to cast spells before was now sorely missed. Struggling to remember the correct glyphs and movements of her hands, she began to weave a combination of wind and ice magic to create a series of barriers dotted around the battlefield which would shield her comrades from Epimenides' attacks. Although she doubted it would be enough to stop him, it might at least slow him down and give them a fighting chance. As she concentrated on her spells, Constance noticed that her hands were trembling, and her magic was yet weaker than she had hoped. However, she couldn't allow herself to give in to fatigue, not when the lives of her friends and allies were at stake. She gritted her teeth as she worked to maintain the barriers, watching the others clash with Epimenides. They were all struggling as well, but they nevertheless continued to fight, refusing to stand down. Will we all die here? The thought struck her from out of nowhere, perhaps a fearful call for help from her other side, and she couldn't help but wonder whether for once, that part of her might actually be correct. This was the strongest foe they had faced so far, even stronger than Lysias. If some of the best warriors in Adrestia could not defeat Epimenides, and were quickly growing more and more fatigued in their attempts to do so, who was she to believe that she could even make a dent in his defenses? The sound of a cry of pain from the battlefield snapped Constance out of her spiraling thoughts. She saw Byleth stumble back, a visible wound on his arm, and knew she could not afford to lose faith in herself or her allies. It was not a question of whether they could win, they had to. The stakes were too high to consider failure. Constance sent a gust of wind to push Byleth out of harm's way, just in time for Sylvain to swoop in and land a strike on Epimenides with his lance. While it didn't seem to cause any significant damage, it did distract him long enough for Happy to send a bolt of elder magic his way. He deflected it, but the attack had bought them a few precious seconds. It was in those few seconds that Constance noticed a change in the battlefield. Bias, who had focused completely on shielding Lady Edelgard up until now, stopped and glanced around. After taking in the rest of the throne room, her eyes landed on Constance, narrowing with suspicion. Before Constance could react or call up a shield, Bias disappeared from her position with a flash of violet darkness, only to reappear mere inches in front of her. Startled, Constance stumbled back, losing her concentration on the barriers she had been maintaining. Before she could regain herself, Bias used a swift and practiced motion to disarm her, the magical energy dissipating from her as she felt the now acutely familiar Elder Sharing spell drain her once again. "Where is he?" Bias demanded, her voice laced with venom as her fingers twitched against her wrist. Constance, taken aback by her sudden appearance, struggled to come up with a response that wouldn't place Hubert in danger. There was no doubt that she was asking about Lysias, and if she were to realize that Hubert had brought him to the dungeons, she might go after them. With as much confidence as she could muster, she held Bias' gaze with hers and replied, "I do not know. Perhaps he escaped to save his own hide." The anger in Bias' eyes intensified, and for a brief moment, Constance wondered whether this would be her end at last. But just as Bias raised her hand to deliver what would likely be a devastating blow, a burst of light erupted between them, momentarily blinding Bias and causing her to stagger back. Constance shielded her eyes, blinking away the brightness, and when she looked up, she saw a familiar figure dart forward and protectively take up a stance in front of her, one hand raised and glowing with light magic while the other drew a dagger from his belt. "I suggest you back off," Yuri warned, his voice steady and light, although there was a clear hint of danger in it as well. "You don't want this to end like last time, do you?" "Yuri," she gasped, noting the quick flicker of his gaze toward her before he refocused on Bias. She hadn't even considered the possibility that Yuri might come to aid them in their battle. After all, for all that she knew, he had been asleep in their inn when she and Shay left Morpheus. For him to arrive this soon after them, he must have managed to make it in time for the very next ship headed for Inver. Either way, his arrival made relief and hope surge within her. She knew that he was more than just a skilled fighter, he was an adept and quick-footed tactician, able to read the flow of battle and devise strategies on the fly. This ability, coupled with his agility and unique magical talents, would be invaluable in this battle. The fact that their last interaction with each other had been awkward at best was an issue for another day. "You again?" Bias spat, her eyes filled with disdain. Yuri smirked, twirling the dagger in his hand with an air of casual confidence. "Indeed, me again. You seem insistent on threatening the wrong people." Constance could see the frustration growing in Bias' expression. She suspected that Yuri was more than capable of handling himself against Bias, but she couldn't help the worry that still gnawed at her. Was he being too cocky? Without comment, Bias quickly channeled and sent a surge of elder magic in Yuri's direction. He deflected it with a swift motion, sending the energy crashing into a nearby pillar. His smirk remained, but his expression was tense, betraying the seriousness of the situation. "Don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he lunged forward, engaging Bias in close quarters combat as she prepared her next spell. When she fired her attack, he quickly darted to the side and behind her, aiming a swift kick at her back that sent her stumbling forward. She spun around, snarling as she launched another powerful spell at him. He deftly sidestepped the attack, which smashed into the wall behind him, causing a large part of it to crumble off and crash into the floor. Constance watched in awe as Yuri continued to match Bias blow for blow, using his wit and cunning just as much as his physical and magical prowess. He didn't seem to be aiming for a finishing blow, but rather keeping her occupied and off balance. It was a dangerous game he was playing, but Constance knew that it was likely their best option at the moment. However, Bias was not a foe to be trifled with. She quickly learned to keep up with Yuri, if not by matching his speed, then by the way that she seemed to predict his next movement, and she soon began to regain some control of the situation. As Constance watched in growing concern, she noticed the dark glint in Bias' eyes that signaled a more cunning strategy at play. She was tired of being toyed with, and her frustration was mounting. Swiping her hand to the side in a familiar motion, she conjured up a burst of darkness that enveloped her, and in the next second, she had vanished. Yuri tensed, dagger at the ready, his gaze flickering around the room as he searched for any sign of her reappearance. Moments later, she re-emerged behind him, her hands enveloped in elder magic, poised to strike. "Behind you!" Constance yelled as soon as she saw the first sparks of magic appear in the air. At the last possible moment, Yuri spun around, his dagger slashing through the air and intercepting her attack. The resulting explosion of magical energy threw both of them back, slamming Yuri into a wall and sending Bias skidding across the floor. Constance's heart leapt into her throat as she watched her friend crumple to the ground, his dagger slipping from his grasp. With a groan, he tried to push himself up again, but the impact had left him dazed and vulnerable. "Yuri!" she cried out, her own magic flaring to life as she prepared to intervene. But before she could move, Bias was back on her feet, rage burning in her eyes. "This ends now," she growled, and for the first time since focusing on Constance, she moved her attention away from Yuri and toward the main battlefield, where the battle against Epimenides raged on. Raising her voice, she called to him over the chaos of the battlefield. "Epimenides! If you truly wish to avenge our people and protect those of us who remain, turn away from the Ashen Demon and focus your attention on the one who destroyed Shambhala in cold blood. Our true enemy is Constance von Novelli." Constance's blood ran cold at Bias' words. She could see the moment Epimenides hesitated, his gaze shifting from Byleth to her. Her feet backed away from him automatically as she realized that Bias had just turned an already difficult situation into a potentially disastrous one. The weight of Epimenides' stare felt like a heavy chain, constricting her and draining all hope from her heart. "You," he said, and although he did not raise his voice, it boomed louder than any other above the fray. He moved toward her, effortlessly shielding himself from harm with his magic as her allies tried to stop him from advancing. As he drew nearer, his gaze moved down to her wrists, his mouth twisting into a scowl as he noted the lack of bracelets. "The cursed one. The one who lost her magic. The researcher who somehow sensed my presence before I had even come into my full power." He stopped no more than 10 feet away from her, eyes locked onto her. As her gaze flicked downward, she noted for the first time that he seemed to hover just slightly above the ground. "You mean to tell me that you dealt such a devastating blow to the dwellings of my people? You destroyed a city inhabited by thousands of innocents." Constance took another step back, only just catching her balance as she stumbled on a crack in the floor. In the corner of her eye she could see how Yuri, still somewhat dazed, slowly managed to get to his feet, his eyes flickering between Constance and Bias, before landing on Epimenides. "She tapped into the ancient powers of the city," Bias called, expression cold and hard as she too regarded Constance. "The destruction was complete. Thousands of our people, buried under tons of rock and dirt." A flicker of emotion passed over Epimenides' eyes as he took this in. His mouth quivered, as though he struggled to contain his resolute expression. "And to think," he said, flexing his sword arms, "that I hesitated to leave you to your fate. That I swore to remember your sacrifice." Constance opened her mouth, struggling to think of a response. Her feet brought her further and further back, but Epimenides slowly followed, gaze still intensely fixed on her. She knew that her back would soon meet with a wall, but she could not bring herself to stay in place, so overwhelmed was she by his complete and utter focus on her. "Shay, please, if you can hear me." "He cannot," Epimenides boomed, eyes flashing. "And even if he could, he cannot save you now." With a flourish of his hand, he sent a wave of dark energy hurtling toward Constance. As she screamed out and fumbled to throw up a shield, Yuri moved with cat-like reflexes, pulling her along with him out of the path of the spell. They narrowly dodged the brunt of the attack, but Constance could feel the powerful magic sing the sole of her shoe before she was pulled hard into Yuri's chest, his arms wrapping around her protectively. As they tumbled to the ground, Yuri managed to cushion their fall, shielding Constance from the impact. With a determined look in his eyes, he quickly helped her to her feet before taking a defensive stance in front of her. Over his shoulder, Constance's eyes jumped to the location where she had been standing when Epimenides launched his attack. The floor was pitch black in a 5-feet-long diameter around it. Yuri locked eyes with Epimenides, his jaw set in defiance. "You fight all right," he said, "for a 1,000-year-old mole person." Epimenides did not give so much as a single hint of amusement, not even a quirk of his mouth. He simply refocused on them again, cold hatred gleaming in his eyes. "Yuri," Constance breathed, causing him to briefly glance at her. "This is a foe more powerful than anyone we have faced before. You cannot hope to keep him at bay alone." "Oh, I know," he replied. "I know exactly what we're facing here." Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a folded piece of parchment and handed it to her over his shoulder. "Here. I think this might come in handy." Bewildered, Constance took the note from him and unfolded it, scanning its contents quickly. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was looking at. It was the separation spell that Lysithea had shown her and Linhard on their first day in Morpheus, the spell that was meant to be used to separate two entities housed within the same body. She looked up at Yuri, mouth opening to ask him how and why he had managed to get his hands on it, but he shook his head. "You know what to do." With that, he moved back into the fray, his light magic flickering as he leaped toward Epimenides. He moved with a grace and speed that was nearly impossible to follow, darting between multiple points so quickly that it seemed as though there were several copies of him flickering in and out of existence, forcing the ancient commander to divert his attention. His movements were swift and calculated, striking at Epimenides' weak points while avoiding his powerful attacks. Constance marveled at the display of his light magic, watching as it effectively distracted Epimenides from whatever gruesome spell he had doubtlessly intended to fire at her. While Epimenides was being distracted by Yuri, Bias made a move as if to attack Constance again, but was stopped in her tracks by an elder spell coming from an unexpected direction and had to spin around to face the new threat. Constance's gaze flicked toward the source of the attack and fell upon Happy, who stood next to Sylvain with her hands enveloped in magical darkness, gaze burning with rage. "If you dare to even try to touch Coco or Yuri Bird again, I'll smash you into the ground and rip that fucking stone you call a heart out of your chest." Sylvain's eyebrows flew up toward his hairline at his wife's threat, but then his lips quirked into a smile as he moved into a prepared stance with his relic lance. The weapon shuddered in anticipation. "Trust me," he called to Bias, "she absolutely will." Constance felt her eyes well up with tears of gratitude as she saw her friend's bravery. She had missed Happy immensely, and yes, even the sight of Sylvain struck a nostalgic chord. While she was relieved that they were at the very least still alive, it also saddened her that this had to be their reunion. Oh, what she would not have given for a cup of tea in the drawing room with her closest friends and allies right now. But alas, it would have to wait until they had defeated their greatest adversary yet. As Yuri continued to keep Epimenides occupied along with Byleth and Lady Edelgard, and Happy and Sylvain focused on distracting Bias, Constance was determined to take advantage of the opportunity provided to her by her friends. Breathing as calmly as she could, she lowered her gaze to the parchment, her fingers tracing over the spell's intricate design. The spell's complexity was daunting, but she knew that she had no choice but to attempt it. If only Hubert were still here, she caught herself thinking. Despite the spell having been kept in the Great Morphean Library, it was clearly authentic and pure elder magic. She would have hoped that she would be more well-versed in such magic at this point in her life, but after months without her magic, she had unfortunately fallen behind in her studies. Hubert, however, would surely have been able to aid her in interpreting and casting this spell. She tried to ignore the sounds of battle around her, focusing all of her concentration on the intricate glyphs and incantations written on the paper as her mind raced to recall every piece of knowledge she had accumulated regarding elder magic. Elder magic is channeled from the inside and out, which means that this part here should come first, and those glyphs there are tethered to each other through an algebraic formula, with the exponent of theta being 7, meaning that the variable of the third expression should logically be read as. A furious cry drew her attention back to the battlefield, where her friends were fighting tooth and nail to hold their own. Yuri continued to dance around Epimenides, his sword and daggers flashing with light magic. He moved with an almost supernatural agility, his body flickering between multiple positions so rapidly that it was nearly impossible for Epimenides to track him. Each time Yuri struck, his weapon left a trail of shimmering light in its wake, further disorienting their enemy. She realized the outcry must have come from Epimenides, who was clearly growing frustrated. Constance forced her gaze back to the parchment, knowing that every second counted. She couldn't afford to be distracted by the fight, as much as she wanted to be there to support her friends. She had to trust that they could hold on while she figured out this spell. Focus, she told herself, taking a deep breath. Why had she never bothered to study this when she first came upon the spell? Why had she so quickly dismissed it as irrelevant? Curses. With an annoyed huff, disappointed in herself but determined to prove her mettle now, she went back to the complex algebraic formula, squinting at the tiny, intricate symbols. Her fingers traced along the parchment, moving swiftly between glyphs and arcane symbols as she pieced together the formula in her mind. Everything Hubert had taught her was coming back to her, piece by piece. She knew that she needed to find the correct coefficients, the correct exponents, and the correct combination of variables to channel the spell properly. Now let's see. The coefficient determined the intensity and reach of the spell. A larger coefficient would make the spell more powerful, but it would also increase the strain on the caster. She would likely need a large coefficient for this spell if she wished it to affect Epimenides. The exponent, in turn, played an important role in dictating the duration of the spell's effects. She could see that this spell included the exponent, but surely duration was not relevant for a spell with this particular purpose. As for the variables, just as in black magic, they represented the different elements of the spell that needed to be manipulated. They had to be balanced correctly, as even a slight discrepancy could cause the spell to spiral out of control. Important mathematical relationships existed between all variables, but they also possessed an individual significance to the spell's overall stability and success. Lastly, the constant was the key to unlocking the full potential of the spell, what bound the entire formula together. A smile tugged on her lips, the spell's structure beginning to make sense as she identified patterns and connections between the various components. This was the thrill of magic that she lived for. If I set the coefficient of this expression to a factor of 8, that means that the corresponding variable must be increased by, yes, that would make sense. The square root of 9 multiplied by the sine of the angle formed by these two glyphs, followed by the integration of the two separate functions that are linked together by this arcane symbol, creating an interlocking pattern, almost like the roots of a tree, she noted with a sense of accomplishment. The realization allowed her to discern the connections between the different symbols and expressions, gradually revealing the underlying structure of the spell. The more she examined the spell, the more she realized that it was a masterpiece of magical artistry. The way the symbols and expressions intertwined, the way they were carefully balanced, and the delicate interplay between different types of magic, it was all breathtakingly beautiful. It was clear that whoever had originally crafted this formula had taken great pains to perfect it, creating a spell of immense power and precision. As Constance continued to pore over the parchment, the sounds of battle around her seemed to fade into the background, as though they were little more than white noise. She trusted that her allies would keep her out of immediate harm as her eyes scanned the page at a rapid pace, each new revelation about the spell filling her with a sense of excitement and urgency. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the intricate workings of the spell coming together in her mind like a finely crafted tapestry. But then a sudden, sharp cry of pain jolted her back to reality. She glanced up in time to see Lady Edelgard stumble back, a pained grimace on her face as she knelt behind Byleth, who had rushed in to cover her while she recovered. Epimenides had clearly grown tired of playing Yuri's game and returned his attention to the Ashen Demon, striking where it would hurt the most, his fiancée. Constance's heart leapt into her throat. She needed to act now. Lowering her gaze yet again, her fingers hovered above the parchment as she mentally pieced together the final components of the spell. Some elder spells, such as this one, included words to chant along with the casting in order to reach the necessary precision of the caster's intentions. These words were naturally in Agarthan, and although Hubert had spent some time teaching her the fundamentals of the Agarthan alphabet, she was not completely confident that she was pronouncing the words accurately, or that she had correctly adjusted the phrases in line with the rest of the formula. Hubert had yet to teach her how to actually communicate in Agarthan, so she had no way of making certain that the chants would make sense. However, what choice did she have but to try? With a deep breath, Constance raised her hands and began the incantation, her voice clear and strong despite her racing heart. As she chanted the unfamiliar words, she could feel the energy building within her, a testament to the power that lay dormant in her blood, the power of generations of elder mages before her and which Hubert had passed on to her through the elder ritual. As a violet magic circle flickered into existence beneath her feet, she knew that she was on the right path. She could feel the ancient magic stirring, eager to be unleashed. It felt powerful but volatile, a wild beast struggling against its bonds. While she chanted, her eyes flicked between the parchment and Epimenides, who continued to struggle against Yuri and the others, growing increasingly frustrated with their relentless attacks. Good. Keep him occupied, keep him distracted. Her limbs were beginning to tremble, a mixture of exertion, fear, and excitement. This was a highly volatile spell. If she made even the slightest mistake, it could mean the end of everything she held dear. But if she succeeded, it would be her greatest achievement yet. Just as she was about to move into the next phase of the spell, a hand gripped her wrist. Constance jumped, momentarily distracted from her spell work. Her blood had already run cold when she stared up at her assailant, taking in his bemused expression. "What are you doing?" Hubert asked sharply, a mixture of fear and caution in his eyes. At once, the panic that had arisen at feeling his hand locking around her wrist evaporated, exchanged for relief. Hubert was returned to her. If anyone could aid her with the spell, it would be him. As he released her wrist, she wordlessly handed him the parchment, watching as he took it and studied its contents with his eyebrows raised. After just a few brief seconds, his gaze flicked over to hers. "Constance," he said, anger bubbling beneath the surface along with some other unidentifiable emotion. "This is incredibly strong elder magic, demanding exceptional power. And we have barely even begun to scratch the surface of the Agarthan language, knowledge which is required in order to properly adjust such a powerful formula. Had I not stopped you just now, you would have likely sacrificed your own life force to cast it." She swallowed, feeling the weight of his words sink in. Sacrifice her life force? Of course that had not been her intention. Yet what choice did they have? "It is our only hope," she argued, discreetly gesturing to Epimenides, who was still holding his own against their allies. "If even Byleth cannot so much as make a dent in his defenses, how do you expect anyone else to stand against him? We need the power of the elders." Hubert followed her gaze, gritting his teeth. When he looked back at her again, his eyes were filled with unwavering determination. "I will not have you forfeit your life to cast a spell that is well beyond your capabilities, especially not when the probability of its success is less than 1%. She tore her arm out of his grip, taking a step back to glare up at him. "Then what will you have me do?" she demanded, staring up into his dark, inscrutable eyes. Hubert's lips formed a tight, grim line, betraying the internal struggle he was grappling with. For a moment, she felt a pang of resentment. How could he not see that she was trying to save them all? Her eyes flickered back to Epimenides, then to Byleth, who was struggling to hold his ground against the powerful foe. She couldn't stand by and watch her friends and allies fall, one by one. She needed to do something, anything, to tip the scales in their favor. Turning her gaze back to Hubert, she pleaded with him, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. "I need to try, Hubert. I cannot stand by and do nothing." Hubert's face contorted in pain, a rare display of vulnerability that tugged at Constance's heart. She knew that he, too, was desperate for a solution, but she could see the fear that gripped him, a fear of losing someone he loved. The fear with which he had struggled for years now, and which she knew was powerful enough to momentarily blind his rational side. It was that fear that held him back, that made him hesitate to let her take this risk. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, Constance could not back down. She steeled herself, determined to harness the power of the elders, regardless of the consequences. It was their only hope, and she would not let her or Hubert's fear dictate their fate. Finally, Hubert let out a heavy sigh, releasing some of the tension that had been building between them. "Very well," he conceded, his voice strained. "But I will not allow you to do this alone. We will adjust it together, and then I shall guide you through it as best I can." Her heart swelled with gratitude, relieved that he grasped the urgency of their situation. With a nod, she turned her attention back to the parchment as Hubert returned it to her, her resolve firm. The weight of his body was close, warm and reassuring, as he leaned in over her shoulder to indicate various parts of the spell's formula. His finger traced the complex algebra, lines, and symbols seemingly dancing on the aged paper. "The key to any successful elder spell," Hubert began, his voice steady and calm despite the turmoil surrounding them, "lies in the manipulation of the variables within the formula. Remember what I told you regarding these here." He pointed to a series of symbols representing arcane coefficients. "These determine the spell's power and effectiveness." Constance felt a shiver run down her spine as Hubert's breath brushed against her ear, but she forced herself to focus on the algebraic formula he was explaining. She nodded in recognition of what he was telling her, even as she noticed for the first time that the coefficients were grouped in a peculiar pattern, one that she had never seen before. She must have missed that earlier. "The sequence of these coefficients," Hubert continued, "is designed to amplify the spell's power exponentially, but it also increases the strain on the caster. You must be careful to balance the power you draw from your reserves or mine, or we risk being consumed by the spell itself. Furthermore, you'll notice that the variables within the formula represent different aspects of the spell's effect, from the kind of separation to the duration of its effects, which is in turn connected to the exponent. We must be precise in our manipulation of these variables to achieve the desired outcome." She frowned as she took this in, then turned her head to look up at him. "The duration of its effects? Does it need a duration?" She recalled that he had taught her about the exponent's impact on a spell's duration, but surely this specific spell should not be restricted to any particular duration? After all, they wished the separation to be permanent, not temporary. "All elder spells need a duration value," he admonished softly. "It's an inherent part of the syntax." She nodded quickly, feeling somewhat foolish as she recalled that he had indeed told her so at an earlier point in time. In her defense, however, the battle raging nearby was rather distracting and made it difficult to focus. "Then we choose an incredibly large number," she suggested, "one that is, for all practical purposes, infinite. That way, the spell's effect will persist indefinitely." "Well, you could," Hubert said, "if you wished to drain yourself completely. However, this is already an incredibly complex formula as it is. You need to be efficient in your casting. How long do you realistically need the separation to be? Perhaps it is enough to weaken him for long enough that we can strike him down." Constance hesitated, thinking through Hubert's words. She knew that he was correct. Casting the spell for an indefinite duration would be far too taxing on both their reserves. They needed a more practical approach, one that could give them the upper hand without draining them entirely. "I suppose," she conceded, "we need only separate them long enough for our allies to defeat Epimenides. An hour, perhaps." Hubert studied the formula again, his eyes darting back and forth as he made mental calculations. "With our reserves, we can afford 2 minutes at most." Constance's heart sank at his words, her pulse quickening as the reality of their situation settled in. 2 minutes was barely enough time to make a difference. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. 2 minutes, then, she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. Hubert hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering to the battle beyond them, where Byleth was fighting valiantly against Epimenides. "There are other factors to keep in mind here as well," he said, voice growing urgent as he pointed to a series of nested parentheses near the bottom of the formula. "For example, this part here represents the energy conversion necessary for the spell to function. The amount of magical energy you will need to channel is directly proportional to the distance the spell will travel." Constance nodded, gaze lifting for a moment to make a quick calculation of the distance between them and Epimenides. While she had always been skilled in the magical arts, the algebraic components of elder spells were far more intricate than anything she had encountered before. She understood now why Hubert had been so hesitant to let her attempt this spell alone and why he had immediately stopped her as soon as he saw her begin the casting. But even as she felt the burden of this complexity settle in her chest, she also felt an exciting thrill reminiscent of how she had used to feel back when Crow instructed her in Elder Magic. Back then, his instructions had been given only in written form, his identity and voice unknown. Having Hubert standing here behind her, leaning in over her shoulder to guide her through the spell, was strangely surrealistic. "There is no time to write down the adjustments," Hubert said as he straightened behind her. "Do you have the formula, as well as the corrected variables, memorized?" Feeling the urgency weigh heavy on her, Constance ran through the formula once again, eyes darting across the page. "Yes." "Good. As for the chant, you shall have to repeat after me. Give me your wrist." She lifted her hand up so that he could grab it above her shoulder. His fingers locked around her, and in the next moment, she could feel the familiar rush of his magical energy joining her own, noting that it was indeed more meager than usual. "Ready." She took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment to gather her courage. "Ready," she confirmed. Check the description for the links to the author.